For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Upon scum to people, evolution, as I've said before, is pure imagination. It's science to say that dogs produce dogs, but it's not science to say that dogs, pine trees, bacteria, and whales are related. There's a lot of imagining going on. Evolutionists imagine that mutations make something new and better. Evolutionists imagine that all these small-scale variations will eventually add up to make something we don't actually observe. Time, as I've said before, is the hero of the story for the evolutionist. Evolutionists and SpongeBob should start a private school together. This is the perfect way for evolutionists and like-minded individuals to teach each other that dinosaurs and carrots are related through common ancestry. Stay tuned for a thorough tour of SpongeBob University. But welcome to SpongeBob University. Evolutionists hope, they dream, they imagine. Only the most imaginative of evolutionists are accepted. Requirements for those that believe they have the wild imaginations necessary for enrollment at SpongeBob University, just a few of them. You must believe that natural selection and mutations can explain all new innovations, structures, body plans, and novel information, which we actually know cannot actually be the result of natural selection acting upon random variation and random mutations. Evolutionists imagine these things, even though empirical evidence tells us that neo-Darwinism lacks incredible explanatory power in regards to the origin of phenotypic complexity, anatomical novelty, and the origin of non-gradual modes of transition, abrupt fossil appearance, for example. Students of SpongeBob University must also imagine that they share ancestry with apes. Grandpa, is that you? Even though all empirical evidence suggests otherwise.
I wish I could see Aaron's eyes right now. I bet they're just bulging out like that cartoon.
Yeah. What
was that argument?
Upon scum to people.
Dude even lost me on that one. I don't know.
All right, everyone. Let's kick this off. This is Aaron Raw debunking our video, debunking his phylogeny challenge. Let's get this started.
In this first one, because I know it's 3 hours worth of mindless stupidity.
Wow, he must have gone through every little bit of that video, piece by piece, to complain about it being 3 hours. Let's see if that's true, shall we? Of eyes, because their eye type.
Have you heard anything to do with this, Aaron?
Hadn't been thought of.
No.
Okay.
Never heard of it. It's the first 3 seconds of the video.
EAX6 is one of those pesky instances for evolution.
I clicked on like 2 or 3 spaces in it, and I only watched it a few seconds at a time.
Oh, okay, there we have it. That's the truth. He only watched a few seconds here and there on a video that he came on to debunk. Brilliant.
Have you heard anything to do with this, Aaron?
No. PAC6 is a master control gene, so yeah, I don't see. I mean, he's getting the. I think he's getting the science correct, I guess, but I don't think his conclusions follow.
I don't think I've ever heard of Standing for Truth. Raw Matt sounds familiar.
Oh, Standing for Truth.
I feel like I might even have talked to him once.
Standing for Truth.
Yeah, I would hope you'd remember me. We had multiple conversations. But let me guess, maybe the most popular? Well, that's argument of authority, and if we're going to use that argument, then atheists are toast as well, because your pathetic 5% of the world's population trying to say that the burden of proof is on the 95% is just stupid. The masses don't need to convince the minority of anything.
That was a
also,
slap
how
right
can
there.
You call evolution or species
It was a tradition that is now being discarded, that you would separate humans from apes and apes from monkeys, saying that and this is one of the problem with a number of traditional scientists still haven't understood.
So Aaron just said that traditional scientists, even those today, just don't understand. That's what he's trying to tell you. He knows better. But yet when we try to correct science, oh no, we can't do that. See the problem? See the double standard? So when a creationist says that man and apes are not related, we're lying. But when a scientist says that they're not related, they're just mistaken or confused. Got it. when they say things like evolution only deals in biology. Then they go on and use geology, paleontology, earth scientists, and more to strengthen their argument for evolution and to help them build their phylogenetic trees, saying to others, see how all fields of science help prove evolution? It's called conscience. But yet they get very upset when a creationist does the same thing. No, I'm not upset that evolutionists use paleontology and geology. I'm upset that during arguments and debates, I'm not allowed to use them. Everyone always says evolution only has to do with biology. They didn't even understand what I was trying to say. They didn't listen. They didn't even start at the beginning. That was the problem. When they started looking recently, they found that turtles have no shells when they spend their life in the ocean. The longer they spend their time in the ocean, the less they need a shell. Since I don't think R and Raw either believed me or didn't understand what I was saying, I guess I'll post it here. This is the National Geographic website, who also stated that once turtles hit the water, their shell size reduces. The leatherback turtles themselves don't even have hard shells.
It's not.
There are two different cladistics definitions for turtle. They're still debating.
No, there are not. There is not two different.
Yeah, there are two different cladistic classifications for turtles, Aaron. I don't know why I'm teaching you this. This is your specialty, for God's sake.
Which major taxonomic group, or clade, of reptiles that turtles belong to? Now, most of reptiles fall under the clade known as Eureptilia, or true reptiles. This includes stuff like lizards, snakes, dinosaurs, and birds. But there's also Parareptilia, or side reptiles. These are some of the earliest reptiles, all of which are now extinct, like the spiky-cheeked procolophonids and the mesosaurs, which were probably the first aquatic reptiles. Now, by and large, which clade you put turtles in depends on where you think its shell came from. Turtles' exact place among the Eureptiles isn't settled either. A lot of researchers think they're more closely related to the clade that includes animals like crocodiles and birds, but others argue that they're closer to a different group that includes lizards and snakes. Hopefully it won't take another 130 years for an answer to that debate.
A bacteria can never produce a non-bacteria. It never happens. We didn't evolve from bacteria. We're not bacteria.
Okay, one more time.
A bacteria can never produce a non-bacteria. It never happens. We didn't evolve from bacteria. We're not bacteria.
You hypocrite. You teach frogs came from an amoeba.
You think they could get it in 10 million years? Get a horse with wings.
Why not?
That the phylogeny challenge cannot be debunked, then that makes it not a challenge, right?
It's nothing to be debunked.
Whales.
I know of the earliest fossil bats are neither giant nor burrowing.
Listen to this. And pugs and chihuahuas are still dogs. They have never started to becoming a whale like evolution claims can happen.
And evolution does not claim that, ever.
Where in the world, Matt, would you think evolution claims anywhere that a whale, cicada, could evolve from?
Because whales
from
supposedly
canine.
evolved from a land mammal.
The tale of whale evolution is a story about one of the most remarkable transitions in the history of mammals. The fossil record shows how these animals transform from tiny four-legged plant eaters no bigger than house cats to the seafaring giants we know today. This change was dramatic and kind of fast.
Evolution does not say anything. A individual anything turns into a individual anything either.
Paleontologists in Kashmir, India found the fossils of a 47-million-year-old hoofed creature the size of a house cat that they named Indohyus.
Evolution does not say anything. A individual anything turns into a individual anything either.
Actually, it specifically says that.
Back in a SpongeBob La La Land.
That's what the phylogeny challenge is getting them to identify what the fuck is a created kind.
Okay.
Said honeybee and flower are a created kind. How is honeybee and flower a single created kind? That doesn't even make any sense. How is a plant and an animal the same kind? What?
Oh, no.
Because they're a symbiotic species. The flower needs a plant, and a plant needs a honeybee, for example. They try to say that
Except
beetles
they
and
don't.
wind did it.
Except that they don't. And we know that earlier plants used wind for pollination.
Then
and
how come
earlier
Japan
insects.
Well, that's a presumption, because Japan has now lost
It's
their
not
bees,
a presumption,
and
because
Japan-
it's.
I tried telling him twice, and I couldn't, so I guess I'm going to have to say it now. Aaron, Japan has lost its bees a while ago now, and since then they have had to now pollinate by hand. Do you know why? Because wind cannot do it. And that's what evolution has told us. Matter of fact, that's what you even said to me. But the matter of fact, they have been working on a solution for a while now, and have invented tiny little drones to replace bees, so the intensive manual labor required from the burden can be lifted from the people that have to do it by hand. If wind or insects and beetles were sufficient, then they would not have to go to such lengths. Besides, even Einstein himself said, if bees disappeared off the face of the earth, man would only have 4 years left to live. But it's okay. I'm sure you know far better than him. What did he ever know about anything, right? But let me get this straight. All life today that requires flowering, pollinating plants and the fruit that they bear could not survive without pollinating plants and what they bear. Therefore, bees are absolutely required. Without bees, there is no pollination. And this is a fact. And now we know it's a fact because of the devastation that is happening in China and Japan because of the dwindling bee population. Right? Primates, for example. Yet we are told bees just arose millions of years ago, and the planet has just been so stable for all those millions of years that until now we have a slight variation in temperature, and now all the bees are dying because of it. Like that makes any sense at all. Such a weak, volatile little honeybee, yet survived millions of years on fluctuating Earth's temperatures and climate change, including multiple bottlenecks and cataclysms, and supposedly survived it all. But yet, here we have the bee today, and now we're getting a little temperature spike, and they're dying off rampantly. Here's a bee in the fossil record dated at 80 million years. Here it is in the New York Times magazines. Look at it, complete stasis, hasn't evolved at all. What is your rescuing device from this? Supposedly, there's been multiple bottlenecks since that time, but yet the bee survived that? I don't think so.
You show me proof that anything was ever created, or that anything even could be created like your religion says.
Okay.
So which came first, the chicken or the egg? The theory of evolution would state that the egg came first too. You see, since DNA can only be modified before birth, this would mean a mutation must have taken place at conception. So some kind of animal similar to a chicken would have laid an egg, and a mutated version of that animal would have hatched, which would have been a chicken. This new chicken would then go on and breed and spread its mutation, and more chickens would appear as generations go on. So a lot of the evidence would point that the egg would have come first, but these are all just theories. The true answer to this question lies in protein. British researchers discovered something very interesting when looking at eggshells. They noticed that the protein necessary to create eggshells are only found in the ovaries of a chicken. This means the chicken must have come first. The protein is called ovocleididin 17, and it controls the eggshell's crystallization process. Without this protein, the shell just couldn't form at all.
Next, we have creation of the universe, which obviously there was a beginning, contrary to the many other theories where they tell you that the universe has always existed.
Okay.
Things all the time. This is genetic breakdown. This is degradation. Genomic. Sorry, Steve, you're behind the times on this one. These are not beneficial mutations whatsoever. These are all epigenetic regulations. Here, I'll explain it for you. When you hear about people saying there's such thing as beneficial mutations and we need them and that's how we evolved, and they bring up the lactose mutation and the increase in bone density and the HIV-1 immunity and then the L. Milano, these are all epigenetic regulations. These are not mutations. And so now that we've been unraveling the sequences of epigenetics for the last 6 years really, really well, they've actually completely eradicated the beneficial mutation theory. So basically what I want to do is get into the problems that people are having with the concept. And that would be, kind of explaining epigenetics. So basically, epigenetic inheritance is this new unconventional way of looking at genetics. Up until now, mutations were considered the only thing that could be either positive or negative in regards to fitness, because without mutations, evolution can't occur. So this is where epigenetic comes from, and it goes against basically the idea that inheritance only happens through genetic mutations, or the DNA code passes on to the parent from offspring. This means that a parent's experiences in the form of epigenetic tags can be passed down to future generations. So circadian rhythm, diet, stress, environment, all of these switches, for example, like rats, they took rats and they put them in an aquarium and they switched the lights on for 3 hours and off for 3 hours. And they kept doing this for years. And eventually those rats adapted to this light cycle. So when they had offspring, those children now would fall asleep every 3 hours and every 3 hours, just like the parents were doing, even if the lights were not being turned on or off for every 3 hours. Sometimes it was inherited, other times it was not. And then after a couple generations of lights being back to 24 hours, the rats just essentially gave up on that and they went back to being a 24-hour cycle. So it wasn't a permanent thing. It wasn't a mutation that caused this. So epigenetics is the study of where factors influence a gene and how and when the gene is expressed. Regarding like the Sherpas of the high altitude people of the Nepal, the mainstream thought is that a single 1-point mutation led to a better adaptation for the high altitudes of the Tibetan people. But modern science has revealed that the epigenetic mechanisms are also behind this adaptation. It's not a beneficial mutation. You can read a peer-reviewed paper on this, on the epigenetic signatures of the high altitude adaptation of the Tibetan population. So basically, these epigenetic regulators affect how individuals develop. This is pretty much which are causes of changes in the expression of the genes or action of a gene, or any gene, for example. We have longevity genes in us, for example. They're called the FOXO genes, and they're 7 sirtuin genes, and these are mediated by epigenetics. They're not mutations. They're turned on and off. Like for fasting, for example, turns off a mTOR, and it activates these longevity genes. We want that to happen, and until we can go in and mutate these genes and constantly leave them on, we have to rely on epigenetics to do that, and we are in control of these genes by what we do. So sorry, Steve, you've lost on this one. We have genetic deterioration going on all around us and no beneficial mutations occurring anywhere. And that's a fact. I would like to say that we have a way to determine whether or not our model, we can do this. We can go, what are the odds that all human beings are related by 99.9%? What are the odds that human beings have three
we're not going to do this because I understand how that.
So to actually help them understand some of our models, some of our predictions, some of our thoughts on why we actually believe that the Bible to be true over other religions, I was going to play What Are the Odds game. I could not get out one answer without being cut off. So now I will finish that for you. What are the odds that all humans are 99.9% all related? Just like the Bible says. And all from the Fertile Crescent, exactly like the Bible says. We have been genetically deteriorating since the fall of Adam, because sin brought death into the world, and rapid disease increase is evident, just like the Bible describes. And we can show with empirical evidence that there is both a fast mtDNA clock and a huge increase in diseases every single year. What are the odds that we're all frugivores, just like Genesis 1 says that God placed man into a garden and gave him every fruit-bearing tree to eat from? What are the odds that all obligate carnivores can live off of plants, just like the Bible says? What are the odds that the best genetics are tracked to the Middle East, just like the Bible says where man came from? What are the odds that all languages arose around the same time, just like the Bible describes? How about when the scientists found which came first, the chicken or the egg? Today, we know it's the chicken, just like the Bible says. Again, what are the odds that most religious texts worldwide tell us that man has lived to extreme ages during what is known as the Golden Age? And now we know that language cannot arise on its own, because just like the Bible tells us, God taught Adam. So let alone all these facts, quantum physics has indirectly proven God by proving that the argument against the philosophy called materialism has been now falsified. It's dead. Again, so what are the odds that all humans came from a single female? I don't think people consider this fact very much. Let's just take a look at that last comment that I made about all humans being from a single female. What are the odds of this? If a secular evolutionist even considered this for just a moment, rather than shrugging it off with excuses like there must have been a bottleneck, or there were probably many other women alive and those women didn't have kids, or maybe all of them just had boys, completely non-logical, especially when I describe the scenario for you in a minute. Besides, even according to their own theory, they have no proof of any bottleneck occurring, not in paleontology, the fossil record, or geology, in the geological column. So, what evidence do we have for this belief of a bottleneck? They don't have anything for it. That's your answer. A failed hypothesis is all that they have. You see, this is the real problem. According to the evolution theory, about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, there were about 10,000 to 30,000 individuals. That's an estimate. Now let's just say half were women. That leaves us with 5,000 or 15,000, whatever you want to go with. Let's just say that the average is 10,000 for this debate. So now we have 10,000 different lines of possible mitochondrial DNA to be passed down. Yet we only have one today. What are the odds of this? That's highly improbable. But if you start with the biblical account, this lines up perfectly as to what we would expect and what we do see. There should be just one line, and there is just one line, exactly what the empirical evidence shows. Vast correlations line up directly with what the Bible says, and this is undeniable evidence.
You know, it's interesting. When the Human Genome Project mapped the human genome, they said there's only one race of people. You know what that confirms? The Bible. Because we all go back to Adam and Eve, we're all one race.
So I don't think it confirms the Bible. It just makes the Bible consistent with nature on this one point.
I'm just going to end the game here, because you get the gist of it, but the list is actually very long. And the odds of even a few of these are astronomically high. So imagine 20 of them. It becomes a statistical improbability.
The whole gulab thing we're talking about is a gene that in other species produces vitamin C. We no longer have a functional version of the gulab pseudogenes. It's broken in several places, and I think it's missing the promoter region, so it can't be transcribed. So we actually have to get vitamin C from alternative sources.
So scientists, they're finding that numerous of these so-called genomic fossils are actually not pseudo after all, and these genes are necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. So the broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene, the egg yolk gene, no such remnant exists, and instead the fragment appears to actually be a functional DNA element. You can look at the beta globin pseudogene, some of the whale pseudogenes, the gulo pseudogene. The gulo pseudogene might actually be a broken gene, but at the end of the day, I know people who have had a Chevy Cruze and a Honda Civic, and the air conditioner broke in the exact same way in both cars. Wow, that proves that they both evolved from a skateboard billions of years ago. I mean, that's how silly they are. And science enthusiasts, I got a debate with him on my channel. Go watch it. It was fun.
No, I do. I'm just curious. You are correct. The pseudogenes that they thought were useless genes have all been found to have a function. But if you put a 7-year-old under the hood of your car and say, take out anything this car does not need, he would probably take out a bunch of stuff because he doesn't understand the purpose of it. I think the fact that the pseudogenes and IRVs have all been discovered a use for them is an example of the fact that scientists did not know the usefulness of some of these parts. Life is incredibly complex. The human cell, or any animal or plant cell, is mind-boggling in its complexity. And I think someone with a lack of cell biology knowledge would say, oh, the cell doesn't need that, take that out. Oh, we don't need that. We don't know what that does, take it out. It's an example of ignorance on our part, not an example of ignorance on the creator's part. The cell is mind-boggling in its complexity. It had to have, there are no pseudogenes. There might be stuff that is available as a replication. I carry a spare tire in my car. Why? Well, one of the other tires might go flat. That's why. There may be things in the gene code that if part of the gene is damaged from radiation from the sun during the solar sunspot cycle or something, the body can quickly recover and rebuild it and fix it. So that, and why would a body develop something beyond what it's using? If it happened by evolution, why would you get a spare tire?
And the guy you're talking about tonight, I saw a minute of his video where he said that humans were absolutely different from every other animal in every possible way. Well, no, we're not completely different. We're exactly the same in every possible way.
You might want to warn your wife.
Really? I have yet to see any other animal, especially primate even, ever speak language. Basic communication skills like nouns, sure, but no linguist would ever say that a fish or an ape have a language. As I am looking at my window now, people are driving by in cars. I am yet to see any monkey behind the wheel. Have you? Strange. What about food? We make food. We process food. I'm yet to see any animal making food. How about you? How about music? Any animals creating any instruments to play? Not that I've ever seen. What a surprise. But that's just the obvious observation from looking around. Even biologically, we are not the same at all either. And this is what I was trying to tell Aaron last night. However, he was not listening. Ask yourself, why do they still present evidence as though it's somehow logical that we have lost everything that was good for us, like the different kinds of muscle strength that primates have? They are twice as strong as we are, easily. The video that you're watching right now is going to prove that. They also have a very powerful jaw. They can rip into a coconut within seconds. They are completely immune to infection. They have dense, thick fur protecting them from the elements. We lost all of ours, so now we have to do what? Wear clothing and sleep under more fur? That makes no sense. We sunburn. They do not. We get cancer. They do not. They have far better DNA methylation. They have far better vision and can see better colors for picking all kinds of fruits and flowers and fauna and vegetables. The Tamarin monkey alone eats more than 833 different plants from 167 different floral species, and never need glasses for failing eyesight. We cannot even walk without shoes because of our fragile feet and risk of infection or parasites. They have a very thick meninges, which is the layer around the brain protecting it. We humans have a very thin layer in comparison. They have far more nerve fibers than we do. They have no such thing as outdoor allergies in any primate species, yet humans have them all the time. They have far better hearing, as they have 3 bones in their inner ear that are housed within the skull outgrowth. They have far better bone density. They can fall down and nothing will break in their bodies unless it's from very high. They have 2 separate bones in their forearm and lower leg, giving them far more mobility than us. Humans have a greater susceptibility than other primates to most infectious disease. AIDS, malaria, and cancer kill millions of humans each year around the world, as where that's most non-human primates appear to be naturally protected against all of these diseases. If we were part of the primate species, we have failed. They have outdoor allergies. They never fail, and they have far better hearing. They have far better color visions.
They do have those
everything.
things.
No, Aaron, you're wrong. We use about 2 to 9% of our digestive ability in the colon, as where apes use about 30 to 60%. No matter how much sun they get, they can never get skin cancer. We humans get skin cancer very easily. That's right, everyone. We've lost every single beneficial physiological characteristics. How am I supposed to envision, even with pure imagination, that all of these beneficial traits just micro-evolved away into oblivion? That's not logical in the least when you break it down. As for the so-called just 1% different between apes and people, that's a perfect example of skewing the data. Get a female ape, have her hair styled, worked on her, put her in some long skinny dress, force her to wear some heels and walk, add some makeup and perfume, and then bring her to the prom. See how many guys are going to ask her to dance. Or try to get that ape girl on a blind date. Tell the prospective guy that you can't say too much about her, but she's only 1% different from the rest of the hot chicks he knows. Watch his reaction when he sees her. Evolution teaches you to drop common sense on the floor as soon as they give you another science fact. I don't have enough faith to believe that every single physiological benefit has micro-evolved into oblivion for no reason at all. So evolution isn't guided, yet it's predictable. But then if all evolution, therefore everything is predictable, yet falsifiable, They don't even realize they aren't being logical. So again, the evolutionist would first have to deny their own double standard theory of evolution, which states that evolution is a totally unguided process where mutations are random and things just need to survive, and yet at the same time it also means survival of the fittest, where only the strong survive and the strong genes breed out the weak, totally contradicting each other. It's shocking they don't see it. Look, this whole business about genetics can be easily solved and refuted with logic. The fuss over 1 or even 50% is not the issue. The matter comes down to this: would you let your daughter or sister have sex with an ape? Now, come on, be honest. You were probably grossed out by that, even a little, right? There lies your answer. There's something a whole order magnitude different between a human and an ape. We're not the same and not even remotely similar. Stop being crazy and stop listening to the so-called experts who want you to drop common sense, and I want you to be logical. Case closed. Is there any proof that God designed man to be this way? Oh yes, anatomical observation and comparative anatomy studies prove this as well. Omnivores, for example, can consume both meat and vegetables raw very easily, where both are harmful and hard to digest for humans in their natural form. Both require some form of processing or cooking. All omnivores have sharp fangs and bladed, shaped crushing molars. Omnivores swallow their food after a short, simple crushing. Omnivores have low jaws, which are always embedded inside of the top. Omnivores have no lateral or forward jaw mobility. Omnivore's saliva is acidic, with no pidolin. Omnivores' renal secretion of uricase. Omnivores secrete acid urine. Omnivores all have strong hydrochloric acid in their stomachs. Omnivores require no fiber for peristalsis. Omnivores' facial muscles are very minimal and allow a wide mouth for a gap for food. Omnivores are able to maximize and metabolize large amounts of vitamin A and cholesterol without a problem. Humans have major problems with both. Omnivores are fueled by fat and protein. Humans are carbohydrate-based. Omnivores' intestines are always 3 times the length of their body. Omnivores all have short colons with smooth and alkaline by nature. Omnivores' jaws are angled and not expanded. Complete digestion is within 6 to 10 hours. Omnivores' examples are hogs, brown bears, raccoons, primates. Omnivores are everything eaters who thrive on all raw foods, from leaves and trees and stems to ground roots, natural surroundings, ants, and even each other if needs be. A frugivore, on the other hand, has complete digestion in about 12 to 18 hours, with a long intestinal sacculated colon. They can only metabolize small amounts of vitamin A and require no cholesterol whatsoever. They require fiber for peristalsis. They all have alkaline urine, with weak hydrochloric acid. Fruitarians do not secrete uricose. Fruitarians have alkaline saliva and pidolin. Fruitarians have big salivatory glands. Fruitarians' upper jaws sit on the bottom and have great lateral and forward mobility. Fruitarians chew their food, not just crush it. Fruitarians have flattened big molars, big flattened incisors, blunt canines. Fruitarians see in full color and are fueled by glycogen, and vitamin C is required. Fruitarian jaw angle is expanded, with extensive chewing required and highly developed facial muscles to facilitate this chewing. Fruitarians consist of several types of species, like bats, the owl monkeys, humans, a number of flying foxes, and many passerine birds, toucans, and some species of parrots. Now consider this as well. Human cells have receptors for malic acid, citric acid, ascorbic acid, ascorbyl palmitate, and polyphenols. These are all elements found only in fruits, and they are requirements, yet nothing in the human body requires anything from an animal source. Think about it. If it was a baby, they would need meat to survive, yet this is not the case. That is actually disastrous for a child, as where we absolutely require vitamin C and absolutely require fiber and weak organic acids from fruit. Meat is a class 1 carcinogen worldwide. Meat cures no known disease of any kind, only causes it. Only plants can cure people. If you think about it, by all means, name a medicinal chicken or a cow. I'll wait. Another way to tell if a species is fruitarian is to map the area of absorptive mucosa in the gut. versus functional body size. Even in 1971, a study done by B.J. Myers was published in the South African Medical Journal, describing how lipid profiles and glucose tolerance improved on a particular fruitarian diet. In a further trial in the study, body weight and overweight subjects showed a tendency to level off at the theoretical ideal weight. Humans are frugivores by design, but when we look at the ability to eat other food groups like an omnivore through the process of cooking skills, then it's possible. Without cooking, we are not able to survive as a raw omnivore. If you think you can, by all means, please go outside, pull some leaves off trees, catch an animal wild, raw, and eat them up, pull some grass out of the ground that you're walking on, and feast. See some wild legumes growing? No problem, pull those suckers off and eat them. You'll be dead in no time. You are not an omnivore, you are a frugivore, just like God designed us to be. I have been one since 2002. And no, I do not supplement. Evolutionists actually believe in the same thing we Christians do in this regard, even if they don't know it or not, that early man was a frugivore. Because think about it, either man was placed in a garden, created for the fruit of the trees like the Bible says, or man evolved. Well, if man evolved, what did he do before he invented fire? That's right, he ate it raw. Raw fruit. It's obvious, because you can't run around eating raw meat. It's proven to be extremely dangerous, and meat is a class 1 carcinogen no matter where in the world you live. Besides, look at the scientific studies what happens when something eats meat. Let's check that out. Yes, vegetarian IQ in adults and kids are both higher. Since the smartest people on Earth have also been vegetarians, then it makes sense. Einstein, Tesla, Isaac Newton, Pythagoras, Plato, Da Vinci, Voltaire. So observation shows that plants are better for IQ. Even the most recent study on vegans show that averaged to 10 points higher in both male and female. When animal studies are conducted, even on primates, it's the fruit-eating studies that actually show the bigger brain growth, not meat. Now, how about genetically?
It's often said that we humans share 50% of our DNA with bananas, 80% with dogs, and 99% with chimpanzees. Taken literally, those numbers make it sound like we could pluck one cell from a chimp and one from a human, pull out the tangled bundles of DNA known as chromosomes, unroll each one like a scroll, and read off 2 nearly identical strings of letters. But in reality, the human and chimp scrolls don't sync up so easily. Other large mutations revised huge sections of text, duplicating a chunk of human DNA here, erasing a chunk of chimp DNA there, while throughout the scrolls, tiny mutations swapped one letter for another. When researchers sat down to compare the chimp and human genomes, those single-letter differences were easy to tally, but the big mismatch sections weren't. For example, if a genetic paragraph, thousands of letters long, appears twice in a human scroll, but only once in its chimp counterpart, should that second human copy count as thousands of changes, or just one? And what about identical paragraphs that appear in both genomes, but in different places, or in reverse order, or broken up into pieces? Rather than monkey around with these difficult questions, the researchers simply excluded all the large mismatch sections, a whopping 1.3 billion letters in all, and performed a letter-by-letter comparison on the remaining 2.4 billion, which turned out to be 98.77% identical. So, yes, we share 99% of our DNA with chimps if we ignore 18% of their genome and 25% of ours. And there's another problem. Just as a small tweak in a sentence can alter its meaning entirely, or not at all, a few mutations in DNA sometimes produce big changes in a creature's looks or behavior, whereas other times, lots of mutations make very little difference. So just counting up the number of genetic changes doesn't really tell us that much about how similar or different two creatures are.
Even as far back as 2005, a peer-reviewed study found that we matched primates as low as 86%. Evolutionists have said that if we do not match great apes more than other mammals, then the case for common ancestry is debunked and falsified. Guess what? When testing the protein coding regions of other species, we have found that dogs, cats, pigs, and other species have more relation than primates do. So not only have we falsified evolution through fast-ticking mitochondrial clocks, debunking junk DNA, there's no such thing as beneficial mutations, human language formation cannot arise on its own, but now genetic relation. It has been falsified. Evolution is through.
And then we can give another article for an entire phyla of animals that went extinct before the Cambrian.
This has already been addressed by Standing for Truth multiple times, so just watch this.
You're going to look to the fossil record, and even though it's just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory to account for the large-scale evolution, but all we see is a net loss of information, and the fact that natural selection is severely constrained by selection interference. I mean, how are you gonna, can you give me a few beneficial mutations that are not somewhat deleterious? I mean, how are you gonna build, because if you're looking to, the lower levels of the simple organisms, and I wouldn't say a trilobite is simple by any means, it's certainly complex, look at the eye, but how are you gonna account for that information buildup? Where's the novelty?
Well, that doesn't actually matter. We can start with, evolution starts with a pre-assembled DNA and cellular mechanism. So we start with genes. So we can just lose information. That's fine. It doesn't matter.
Well, no, because if these beneficial mutations that you agree are rare and they can seldom make the type of compensation that's needed to stop the net loss of information, you're not gonna, it's like taking 2 steps forward but then taking 10 steps backward. You're never gonna climb that mountain, and you're never gonna get your fish to fisherman. It's a pseudo-scientific belief, but you can believe in it all you want, Taylor, but I haven't seen any evidence being presented the entire time. You're looking to the fossil record, but bones found in the dirt are not inherited. Traits are. Where's your evidence, genetically speaking? I mean, what do you look to, brother?
You're welcome to check their math, but I just read off to you like 4 or 5 studies where they conclude the exact opposite of what you're saying.
Well, the thing is, you look to, well, for one, I'll go to, those studies and mechanisms, but where's your example of a beneficial mutation? Because I agree that there are mutations that are beneficial given, and they're environmentally dependent, of course. I mean, even looking at, sickle cell anemia, for example, it's still ultimately reductive, but at the end of the day, there is some type of benefit to be had from it. But where's your novel gain in information there, Taylor? Go ahead.
Well, it's context dependent. Not all mutations are going to cause disease in every individual. So you still don't understand how gaining an antifreeze function to your blood is a beneficial mutation?
Well, the thing is, I'm not disagreeing with adaptations, and the thing is, it's funny that the only example you can go to is these notothinioid antifreeze Arctic fish, the antifreeze proteins, because all it is a story. They're looking at it, it's already occurred, and they're making judgments and inferences. Where's your real time? And the thing is, it's probably an epigenetic, non-random genetic change anyways. These fish go into the cold water, and all of a sudden they have these antifreeze proteins that they develop based on pre-existing genetic adaptation. But where's your actual, observable evidence? Not looking at some story, because I know evolutionists like to imagine and storytell, but you're talking about a trade-off here. You're talking about that it's context dependent, but while the genome is degenerating in many possible ways, Taylor, and while a few nucleotide sites may be improving, based on this context dependent beneficial mutations, huge numbers are being degraded. So this type of trade-off you're talking about, it's obviously not sustainable, as it's still going to result in a shrinking functional genome size. So once again, you can believe in it all you want, and I put a capital B on believe, but it's just a science fiction based religion with no actual empirical evidence. I mean, you still haven't presented us any evidence. You look to some bones found in the dirt. I've given you a testable falsifiable prediction based on our model of catastrophic plate tectonics.
Neffy says he wants to have a debate with me, but what he really wants to do is just get in a video hangout where he can, I don't know, yell over me or something.
Yell over you? What? That is basically what you did to me on every single comment or question. Look.
Even argues that our knowledge of molecular processes is not good enough to ever determine or rule out independent origins. So it's telling us that things of density of hair that they have to protecting them from all elements. They don't get sunburned.
Hold on.
Let me know what you think. Now lost their bees, and now they now have to pollinate by hand.
Except that they are not.
Well, this thing can't do that thing. Then that's unfalsifiable, not science.
No, Matt,
well, hold on.
Something as a mammal, but if you want to play by the taxonomic rules, that is very, very strong. They have twice as much density.
Yeah, they do have very, very strong muscles.
Information we're talking about, it would have to be some kind of a gain.
Then we have to get into
pretty recently.
Okay, never mind. These questions.
And humans are just
no, it's not.
have outdoor allergies. They never fail, and they have far better hearing. They have far better color vision.
They do have those
things all the time. This is genetic breakdown. This is degradation, genomic
Can you
deterioration.
explain?
We're not powerful jaw. Look at their immunity. They're immune to
they're all identical.
Other species as well. But when these genes mutate, because they have the same, if evolution was true, they wouldn't have function because they evolved. They are human beings so far long ago.
But you can get
evolution
at a certain stage. That's all. We believe in macroevolution. It just finishes when things.
No, hang on.
They're just saying
even when
because
they know it's wrong.
Even they say they don't know, and there's too much noise at the end of these branches.
0% of what?
Clear definition of what a species is. Now you can't blather.
Okay, so stop.
His videos constantly say.
I know Kent Hovind lies again.
The longer they spend their time in the ocean, the less they need a shell.
Turtle?
Well, the turtle. It's still a turtle.
How many species of turtle? Do you have any idea how many species?
Not there, and to find results.
Whoa.
Like that. I think their understanding of macroevolution is a new morphological feature.
It's a straw man distortion of
by 99.9%. What are the odds that human beings have three
we're not going to do this.
Even argues that our knowledge of molecular processes is not good enough to ever determine or rule out independent origins. So it's telling us that things apply.
How about each other? Will they interrupt each other when they talk? Let's see.
And they are what he would say colloquial, the groupage, and they could be monophyletic or paraphyletic.
Oh wow! Look at that, respectful, amazing. Watch some more, shall we?
All right, Aaron.
Well, once again, no. I always have a good time. It's really the explanation is boring.
Shannon would be really good to do it with something with that along those lines.
Maybe
10 if you're old like me. Be awesome.
And then of course,
and guys,
weekend after that, I'll be back in. So will you admit?
Yeah, listen very carefully. That would be pre-Cambrian.
Okay, and I'm gonna send this to
those
David,
are
unknown, so that we can see this on the screen. And
monkey grunt.
I feel like this is gonna replace the Sphinx guy. Bat thing.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Can you answer that about the bat?
Apply to the same clade.
Yes.
The colloquial word ape conforms to the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea, which means ape.
And we're Hominoidea.
Back in SpongeBob La La Land.
See for yourself how many fallacies and appeals that Aaron Ra uses in just a 4-minute clip with another atheist.
So you want to withhold judgment wherever possible.
What's your opinion of atheists that 100% believe that there is no God?
Me.
Like, are absolutely convinced that that's not the case. Is that you?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful! Can I talk to you about that?
Absolutely.
So
yes.
you think that you think that certifiably 100% that there is no God whatsoever?
That's correct.
Not just the Christian God, but any God. Period.
Right.
How did you determine that?
It's impossible by definition.
Oh, what's the definition?
In order for some, remember I said that we have different rules. You know, that we won't say that something is proven like the believers will. You know, if they find anything that would still be true in either case, they'll say it's absolute proof of their position. Mm-hmm. But we can't do that because that's dishonest. We actually have to have evidence that indicates that and wouldn't be true if the other case were correct. So we have something objective to verify, right? So we can't say that something is possible until we have a precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such a possibility exists. We can't even say it's possible until then. And so we don't have a possibility of God.
True, we can't say that it's possible, but eventually we could determine that if it was possible or not possible. Like, we don't have the method available to us right now to determine if a supernatural God exists because we have no supernatural scientific methods. But in the event that we do and we're able to ascertain that, in fact, no God exists in the supernatural realm, then we would have a better argument to say that there's no God, wouldn't you? What do you think?
Well, there's a handful of words that you kind of need to clarify. Knowledge and truth, and when we're talking about possible. There are things that are possible that we don't yet know are possible, right? But we can't say they're possible until because it would be dishonest.
We can't be justified in saying that they're possible.
The truth is what the facts are. They can tell you that they have the absolute truth, but if they can't show you the truth of it, then they don't have the truth.
Is that justify saying that there's no possibility? Like you're saying it's impossible for a God to exist right now?
It's impossible by definition. I've only given you the first part of that.
If we change the definition, would it then be possible?
If we change possible to mean impossible, yeah, if we reverse everything.
If we define what we meant by a God by like, oh, it's actually Greg. He lives across the street. He has lightning powers. He's from Asgard. Who knew, right? Like,
when people do that, they did the God is love thing, right? And so they want to come out that God is the force that creates us all. Well, that's, again, you've made it so ambiguous that everything is God and thus nothing is God. So if you're going to be talking about what is a God, then you've got to conclude that your definition has to include all of the gods, the hundreds of gods that were worshipped by thousands of people for thousands of years, or millions of people for thousands of years. So if it doesn't apply to Odin, or to Hera, then that definition doesn't work. So for me, I've concluded that a god is a magical, anthropomorphic, immortal.
Okay.
Magical meaning miraculous, which again is impossible by definition. Miracle and magic have the same definition. They're the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events in ways which are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics, which makes them physically impossible by definition.
Okay.
Likewise, it is impossible for God to exist as a disembodied mind absent the brain that created it, because a mind, by definition, is the data that is produced by a brain. So it's definitively impossible. So the truth is what the facts are, and there are things that are true that we don't know are true, but we can't call it the truth until we can show that it is true.
How would you falsify that observation?
What?
Your position on there's no God based on this definition, how is that falsifiable?
How is the falsification falsifiable?
You said it's impossible because of these the magical, anthropomorphic, and disembodied mind and stuff like that. I guess
if you want to falsify the definition.
No, I want to see if is there anything that you would recognize where you'd be like, oh, okay, well then disembodied minds can't exist, or like, oh, okay, well then magic.
Well, you'd have to change the definition of what a mind is. So we just have to switch all the words around. So the truth is whatever you want to believe. And fact is whatever you want to believe. And like I said, the truth is what the facts are. And it has to be objectively verifiable. Believers will call about facts all the time, but if it's not objectively verifiable, and you can't call it a fact. Likewise, they say they have evidence. What is their evidence? Their evidence, I have this book.
I get you.
Why do they keep asking me if I will consider the other evidence? I was raised a secular evolutionist atheist myself. What the hell? Of course I know the other side of the argument. I became a creationist recently because of the evidence.
I remember a presentation by P.Z. Myers where P.Z. Myers was talking about how the vast majority of the DNA is non-coding, how 8% of our DNA is endogenous retroviruses, how some other percent is the product of a buggy enzymatic process, how some of them is copies of copies. And this is the bulk of it. So it's something like 10% or less, or 5% only. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but that's what we have for coding DNA.
We now know that junk DNA, the non-coding regions of DNA, function much like the operating system in a computer that is directing the timing, expression, and regulation and use of the other information or the data files that code for proteins. We know these regions regulate DNA replication, transcription, mark sites for program rearrangements of genetic material, controls RNA processing, editing, and splicing, and repairs DNA. It even regulates embryological and placental development, and even aids in immunodefense. This is just a tiny fraction of what these DNA regions actually do. The fact of multiple overlapping codes make our information systems both polyfunctional and polyconstrained, which is yet another major fatal blow to evolutionary theory. We are dealing here with a highly compressed DNA code beyond the best computer code. We write books. We don't write books that can be read both forwards and backwards. To bring this statement here about junk DNA to a conclusion, this evidence of functionality will distinguish between the two models, evolution versus creation, being discussed. For the evolution model, all differences in nuclear DNA are due to mutations. And in the creation model, differences in mitochondrial DNA sequences are due to design and mutations. When comparing DNA sequences in similar genes in different families, evolution says all differences are due to mutations, while creation says the differences were designed with distinct functionality. And this prediction involving the non-coding DNA regions, evolution says there will be much non-functionality, maybe 20%, while creation predicts functionality for most of the genome. And results from ENCODE project have suggested that at least 80% of the human genome is functional. These results are preliminary, but the trajectory is clear. Most non-coding DNA in the human genome is functional and serves in a regulatory capacity, especially since portions of the genome involved specifically in embryological development were not evaluated. However, systematic knockout experiments can only fully demonstrate this. Junk DNA is dead. Richard Dawkins, in his book in 2009, said it is a remarkable fact that the greater part, 95% in the case of humans, of the genome might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. After Richard Dawkins realized junk DNA is dead based on ENCODE, in a debate, Dawkins stated, "I know there are some creationists who have jumped on it, junk DNA that is, because they think it is awkward for Darwinism. Quite the contrary, of course. It is exactly what a Darwinist would hope for, to find usefulness in a living world." So you can see him changing his mind there in light of the new evidence. The junk DNA and how long?
Minute and a half left.
Well, are going the way of the vestigial organs. They cannot be called upon to support common descent.
All right, Stephen, another objection comes from Michael Shermer in Why Darwin Matters. And he says this: junk DNA basically disproves intelligent design. He says, rather than being intelligently designed, the human genome looks more and more like a mosaic of mutations, fragment copies, borrowed sequences, and discarded strings of DNA that were jerry-built over millions of years of evolution. What do you say to that?
Well, yeah, that's a common argument we hear. If the information, if the genome is intelligently designed, why is there so much junk DNA, DNA that doesn't code for proteins that apparently has no function? And in fact, this is a strange objection because we now know that the junk DNA isn't junk at all. In fact, what we know about the non-coding regions of the genome is that overall they function much like an operating system in a computer that is directing the timing and expression and regulation and use of the other information, the data files that code for proteins. And I've actually brought with me a short list of some of the functions of DNA that have been discovered, and I thought it might be interesting for your audience just to read them. So-called junk DNA, not junk, it's functional. It regulates DNA. Here's some of the short list of functions. It regulates DNA replication. It regulates the process of transcription. It marks sites for programmed rearrangements of genetic material. It influences the proper folding and maintenance of chromosomes. And it controls the interactions of chromosomes within what's called the nuclear membrane and the nuclear matrix. So that's just 5, but I got 5 more for you. Top 10 is like David Letterman. Okay, top 10 functions of junk DNA. Also controls RNA processing, editing, and splicing. Junk DNA, which is not junk again, modulates the translation process. That's what we were seeing in that beautiful animation earlier in the program. It regulates embryological development, it repairs DNA, and it also aids in the immunodefense of the cells. So this is just a short list of 10 of the functions that have been discovered for the so-called junk DNA. It's not junk, and the whole argument against intelligent design based upon the alleged non-functionality of the junk DNA is just wrong factually.
There is garbage DNA that just doesn't do anything. There's junk DNA that doesn't produce proteins.
Actually, the fact that ENCODE has revealed that, over 80% of the genome is actively transcribed into RNA does suggest function. And the thing is, there is accumulating data suggesting further function. And that's why our direct prediction is based on the DNA language itself, because at the end of the day, we speak less than 1%. As far as I'm concerned, given the lack of gene knockout tests of the DNA language. And all you got to do is look at the history of genetics. Taylor, back in the 40s, it was one gene, one protein, one function. So many things have been overturned. I mean, genetically speaking, evolution is, it's dead. So many things have been overturned. I mean, even human chromosome number 2, they say arose through a fusion of 2 ape-like chromosomes. That purported fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human human gene. So junk DNA is dead. They always say, humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes, but these pseudogenes appear to be functional DNA elements, not actually mistakes. As I said, back in the day in the 40s, it was known as one gene, one protein, one function. So many things overturned. RNA, for example, used to be underappreciated. This is decades ago biology. There's massive literature showing unexpected functions of RNA. Evolutionists, as I've said, they hope, they dream, they imagine that pond scum to people evolution is true, but it's just not true. It's pseudoscience. And our DNA code, it's a highly compressed DNA code beyond the best computer code. We write books, but we don't write books that can be read forwards and backwards. DNA can. Look at protein moonlighting.
20 seconds.
Proteins are doing things you wouldn't even anticipate. This redundancy, for example, the cell uses different redundant elements to slow and speed the process. It's a highly compressed DNA code. And that also suggests that, the DNA code is also polyfunctional and polyconstrained, and any change is going to be deleterious. Well, do you know how much on a mammal, how many experiments, because the gold standard of gene functional testing is gene knockout test, right? Knock out that gene, see what the outcome is. Do you know how much percentage has been done on a mammal?
Not sure.
Well, very little. So it would be premature to make the claim that the majority of non-code. I understand that you agree that it's certainly active to some extent, but we would
right. Non-coding does not mean non-functional. They're not saying that. They're saying we know that DNA does this certain kind of coding function. We know of this function, and we can show that the majority of the genome doesn't do this function that we know about. That's all they're saying. They're not saying it does nothing. They're just saying it doesn't do this one function we know about. We can test it for this one function.
But the thing is, a lot of these non-coding DNA regions, say pseudogenes, for example, genetic markers, they'll use those and say that those are, genomic fossils, evolutionary leftovers to build their nested hierarchies, to build their phylogenetic trees. But they didn't predict that those genes are now necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Because why would a genomic fossil, like a pseudogene, for example, be active to that extent? Because that's a pretty significant role. And even in the cases where there are real broken genes, that they're actually discovered, they're often associated with heritable diseases. So are you saying that they predicted that genetic markers like the beta globin pseudogene, the supposed broken remnant of an ancient chicken gene, are you saying that they predicted that those would have important functions?
Again, the only claim they're saying is that it's non-coding. It doesn't do this one thing of coding these proteins in the way that we know it. That's all they're saying. They have no say over what it does in any other thing. So it can do lots of other things. It could do infinitely many other things. We have no idea. The only claim of the non-coding statement is that it doesn't do this one thing that we know that we can measure. That's it. That's all it says.
Well, from what I know of ENCODE, most cell types, they weren't actually tested. They only tested less than 500 cell types, and there's thousands of cell types. Right?
So I'm not talking about
functions are expected from these thousands of other cell types, and that's what we're predicting based on created heterozygosity. Because if he encoded these pre-existing functional DNA differences, we would expect there to be genome-wide functionality, and not just activity, not the fact that it's just idle, but kind of like what we're seeing in these specific pseudogenes, beta globin pseudogene, for example, that they're actually necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Just like ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, very, very important in placental development, the embryo. So everything seems to be at least consistent with that hypothesis.
The ENCODE project would say that anything that has any kind of activity, whether it be conformational changes, whether it be protein encoding, whether it be mRNA, whether it be any kind of spurious transcription, anything that any detectable activity, they call that functional for their purposes. But that's not typically what it is. The functional DNA is a coding for protein DNA, and Standing for Truth doesn't seem to understand the difference or want to understand the difference.
In my new book, Zombie Science, I touch on the issue of junk DNA, so-called junk DNA, about which I wrote another book several years ago, The Myth of Junk DNA. When the function of DNA was first being worked out, biologists realized that only about 2% of our DNA, of human DNA, codes for proteins. And even then, as I point out elsewhere in the book, it doesn't completely code for protein even then. But 98% of our DNA, apparently to them, had no function at all. And so Richard Dawkins and others argued that it was just a leftover from evolution, like a harmless parasite that just hitched a ride on the DNA that actually did something. And so for many years they argued that 98% of our DNA was junk and that this provided evidence for evolution. Jerry Coyne has argued this way. Francis Collins argued this way in a book called The Language of God. And yet, in the last 15 years, we've discovered that this so-called junk DNA actually serves some very important functions. The year after I published The Myth of Junk DNA in 2011, a project called ENCODE, or Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, came out with a whole bunch of papers documenting functions for the 98% of our DNA that does not code for protein. And the functions have just increased since then. I mean, hardly a month goes by when some other element of so-called junk DNA is not reported to be functional. Now, interestingly enough, defenders of Darwinian evolution still insist that it's junk. They say that the measures of function used by the ENCODE team, namely that it produces RNA, or it mainly, that's the main function actually, it has a biochemical function, are not really functions when you look at things from an evolutionary perspective. And since nothing in biology makes sense except in the eyes of evolution, in the light of evolution, according to them, it's still junk. So there's a controversy right now between people who study the actual functions of DNA and those who insist that evolutionary theory is true no matter what. The latter, to me, is a form of zombie science. Well, the ENCODE scientists are just good scientists doing their work to find out how something works. I don't know most of them, frankly, personally, but I don't know any of them that would be called creationists or even intelligent design proponents. So they're just doing their work and reporting their evidence. What they're not doing is they're not allowing evolutionary dogma to dictate their results. And that, to me, makes them good scientists.
Where is it getting that the vast majority of DNA is functional? Because
he runs the argument from the ENCODE project.
Well, I don't think we know. There seems to be a lot of DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. That's actually the code in every cell of your body. You have about 100 trillion cells in your body. And each cell has 46 chromosomes, except for the gametes, they've got 23. Each of those chromosomes is the DNA, is the deoxyribonucleic acid. It is unbelievably complex. There's more code in each cell of your body than there is in any computer ever built by man. Unbelievable amount of information and code in there, more complex than the space shuttle. Each cell of your body is more complex. But what they oftentimes thought was junk DNA turns out to be a backup system or redundant. So in case some DNA is damaged, X-rays from the sun come down here and they go right through your body. On the way through, they just like getting shot with a machine gun. They blow your body full of trillions of little tiny holes. Sometimes they damage the DNA code because they go right through the nucleus of the cell. But the body has a backup system where some of this DNA is in there twice. It's in there redundant. You have the same thing in your car. You probably have a brake and you have an emergency brake just in case, something goes wrong. So it's just wise planning to have a backup system. I don't think we know that there's any junk DNA anyplace. It's probably just a matter of they don't know the use of it yet. What they'll do is they'll take a cell and they'll clip out a piece of DNA and say, see, it lives okay. Well, that doesn't mean it was junk DNA. I think it'd probably be impossible to prove actually there's any junk DNA. It's just a matter of our lack of understanding of what it does, or it's a backup system.
I would agree 100% with you on that one, Dr. Holden.
How 8% of our DNA is endogenous retroviruses.
At the end of the day, if ERVs are found to have function, then it is highly unlikely that they were inserted by retroviruses. And functional ERVs would depend heavily on their position and their sequence. If they were positional and positioned slightly wrong, or they had the wrong sequence, they wouldn't be functional. The evidence is certainly on our side when it comes to this highly compressed, genome of ours. But that means no ERV, none of these endogenous retroviruses should have function.
I want to respond on the retroviral sequences topic. He's absolutely right. There are hundreds of thousands of copies of these virus-like sequences in our chromosomes of mammals and fishes and even the yeast cell. Now, what's interesting is that he's wrong on a number of points. Here's the first point. One of the first class of sequences to be expressed shortly after the first or two-cell embryo, that is from the zygote, including our zygotes, mouse zygote, to the two-cell stage embryo, first class of sequences are the endogenous retroviruses. And you know, it's determined in 2004 is that if you knock those sequences out, you block their expression, you stop embryogenesis at the 4-cell stage. Actually, it's cited in a paper that Jim Shapiro and I, one of the papers published in 2005, where we dealt with this topic, this whole issue of why this so-called junk DNA is functional. Here's another example. What holds the placenta together is a class of proteins, and they form tethers. And the proteins that are coded are specified by retroviral-like sequences. It's different in the mouse than the ones in the human. If you look now, there are these switches that flip gene sequences on and off. They're called promoters. Like you can think of them as molecular toggle switches. A recent analysis of the number of these genetic switches in our genome contributed by these endogenous retroviruses. So many of them, they just have to be garbage. 181,000, roughly. So, and you look at the literature, what they're doing now, and this is, the ENCODE project was published in 2007, a series of papers where they looked at not just the sequences, but the expression of sequences, how they're copied in RNA. And what they found, to their surprise, is that most of the expression is taking place in this so-called non-coding DNA. And you can find papers in Nature and Science, Genome Research, Genome Biology. Thousands of them are out there now. Go to PubMed.org again, just type in junk DNA and see what you pull up. Don't take my word for it. But what you find is that when they investigate these classes of sequences, as numerous as they are, they're finding a whole series of functions. Pseudogenes, for example, so-called pseudogenes, their expression regulates. Yes, they don't code for proteins, that's true. Do they look like defunct copies of other genes? Yeah, they do. But you have two papers back-to-back in Nature, and what they demonstrated is that, well, those so-called non-functional RNAs, the transcripts, are regulating other genes.
A bacteria can never produce a non-bacteria. It never happens. We didn't evolve from bacteria. We're not bacteria.
You hypocrite. You teach frogs came from an amoeba.
Never, ever, ever, period, not at all, does it ever turn into something else that its ancestors wasn't.
Do you believe the T-Rex is related to a carrot? You do believe a T-Rex is related to a carrot. You believe a whale is related to a pine tree. That's a belief system, Mr. Nelson. That's not science. Don't call that a lie. I'm not telling a lie when I say evolution's a religion. It is a religion.
Has ever seen a frog produce a non-frog or a cow produce a non-cow? You can believe it if you want, and you obviously do.
Why are you calling that lie number 4? That's the truth. Nobody's ever seen a cow produce a non-cow. Now, I use the word cow. Cows produce cows, and somebody in my comment section said, oh, Hovind doesn't know anything. It's a cow and a bull that produce babies. Cow is the generic word that I think all people use to describe the cattle kind. Okay, I'm sorry. We'll call them cattle if that helps, all right? I know about a cow and a bull, okay? Anyway.
No, I obviously don't believe that.
Oh, notice the drama. No, I don't believe that. Yes, you do. You do believe the cows and bananas are related. Yes, you do. Be honest.
That is a straw man fallacy because evolution doesn't teach that and never did.
Yes, it does. I'll show you in a second.
You can't produce a secular textbook to support what you said because...
I think I can. Here's the one you're going to mention in a few minutes, the Campbell Biology. This is the 2017 edition, Mr. Nelson. And we got all the pages marked. Yes, the updated latest one. Yes, they do teach all life forms have a common ancestor, so the cow and the banana are related. That is still what they're teaching. Yes, it is.
Because evolution doesn't even permit that, and it would violate evolutionary laws.
Evolution doesn't permit a frog producing a non-frog or a cow producing a non-cow. Watch what they do here now. This is slick. They say, he's going to talk about going forward, cows will always produce cows, dogs will always produce dogs. Mr. Nelson, go look at your charts. Cows and dogs came from an amoeba. Was an amoeba a cow or a dog? Or did it somewhere along the line produce something other than its kind? Did it go out of its clade?
Descent with inherent modification adheres to monophyly, meaning that every new genus or species or whatever is just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were and cannot grow out of their ancestry.
Bingo! You're finally getting it. God made them after their kind, and they always bring forth after their kind. They cannot grow out of their ancestry. Whoa, there's hope, folks. There's a light at the end of the tunnel from this dimwit who thinks that cows and bananas are related. They cannot grow out of their kind. Did the bacteria that turned into a whale and a pine tree, did that grow out of its kind, Mr. Nelson? How can you be such a hypocrite and say they can't grow out of their kind when you do believe they did grow out of their kind? A few more seconds here, we got to go. I got another debate to do here. Okay.
So evolution allows new and different varieties of frogs, but it doesn't allow any frog to produce a non-frog.
You hypocrite, you teach frogs came from an amoeba. Doesn't he?
Yeah.
Think about what you're saying, son.
Nor for an ape to produce a non-ape, which is why we are still apes.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so it was more like a bush than a tree. Okay, so it's very hard to determine the ancestry at a certain point.
Yes, it is, but you expect creationists to identify all these created kinds in your challenge. Like that makes any sense when you guys can't even do it yourselves.
But you're not saying it belongs to a different tree of life from me, are you?
Well, I think the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. So the tree, there may be a bush of life.
Right. Yes.
Bush.
I don't like that word.
Richard, but that's only in.
All right, I concede that point. Yeah.
So there is not a tree of life, and in fact, from our deep sequencing of organisms in the ocean, out of now we have about 60 million different unique gene sets. We found 12 that look like a very, very deep branching, perhaps fourth domain of life.
Right there. Let's start right there.
But disease increase is evident, just like the Bible describes. And we can show with empirical evidence that there is both a fast
Wait, what did he say?
clock and a
Hey, back up about 45.
If Dr. Meyer keeps on adding his intelligent design argument there, he's retreated out of science once again. It's supernatural. It's not a testable hypothesis because he will not allow it to be falsified.
It is testable, and it's testable in the same way all historical scientific theories are testable. You ought to know about the method of historical scientific reasoning. I show in the book, Signature in the Cell, that the case for intelligent design is based on the same method of scientific reasoning that was used by Darwin and by Lyell. That method is a method called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, standard in geology, where I was also trained. And it is and the hypothesis of intelligent design is testable by comparing its explanatory power over and against its competing hypotheses. And it's also testable by comparing the predictive success of the theory.
Mr. Nelson.
Anyone listening to that grifter,
You hippo.
petty and immature,
Turn the fan off so you can hear.
narcissistic need to feel important.
Made in the bathtub. There you go. Go ahead, sir.
Uses his natural lack of charisma as a strategic advantage.
You might want to warn your wife.
Petty and immature a senior citizen can be.
I can shut you up.
I should have known better.
There's nothing to cry about, okay? I couldn't believe that guy. He said pine trees and elephants are related.
Oh, I know.
After all, we both have both eukaryotes, yeah. For that matter, elephants and rocks are both affected by gravity. That proves they're related. I mean, what more proof?
But do they fall at the same rate?
Elephants and chickens are related because they both have feathers except for the elephant. I mean, hello, that's proof. Anything becomes proof for their theory in their thinking, okay? It's mind-boggling they could be that dumb.
Standing for truth doesn't seem to understand the difference or want to understand the difference.
You and SpongeBob need to start a college together.
He bastardizes the ENCODE project, is what he does.
Because the DNA sequences that we possess are largely from living species, we don't yet have a very good analogy for the transitional forms argument. Maybe you could argue with some of the limited data we have. So I'm not going to cover that. But the parallels, again, to the anatomical arguments find an analogy in DNA. Is there genetic evidence that rejects the hypothesis of design? If I'm using design as a competing explanation for the data we just looked at, what about at the genetic level? And of course, Biologos would cite this. If you look at their genetic evidence, they talk about genetic scars, which again, by its name, implies some sort of error. And I'm not trying to misrepresent them. You'll see some of the detailed arguments are arguments from function. So what is the function of DNA? How much of the human DNA is functional? Some evolutionists might say, well, maybe 10% is functional. That's all you can argue for. Let's think back to the evolutionary arguments for the appendix, for the tailbone or the coccyx, for the evolutionary vestige. What was the problem with those arguments? I'd say there were two problems with those arguments. Number one, there are arguments from silence. Absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. I'll say it again, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. It might be, but it might not be. So it's already on a shaky foundation. What makes it even more shaky, and I think a second reason these arguments had faced some severe challenges, is the absence of evidence was not derived from decades of experimentation that failed to identify positive evidence for function. The absence of evidence arose from the absence of experimentation itself. So then no surprise, as experiments progress, that evidence of absence disappears and we find evidence for function. So when evolutionists might say there's little evidence for function in the human genome, the first question to ask, of course, is, well, what experiments have been done? The gold standard is genetic knockout. Fortunately, that's still considered unethical in humans. We shouldn't be guinea pigs where someone goes into you and tries to knock out your DNA just for knowledge's sake. But there are individuals around the planet that have, naturally, because of mutations, because I would say because of the fall, they're missing sections of DNA, or somehow some of their genes have been rendered non-functional. Now, only 6%, I think this is an Icelandic study, only 6% of the genes in the human genome have this sort of individual representation, which means the vast majority of our genes have yet to be tested by the gold standard for function. And since genes represent less than 5% of our total DNA, you can easily see then that the vast majority of our DNA sequence has yet to undergo any experimental manipulation. There's been biochemical studies, you may have heard of the ENCODE project, that they said there was evidence for function in 80% of the genome, and it was criticized as being premature. It is premature. It's only biochemistry. It's not genetics, and they're only looking at a small subset of cell types. There's all sorts of developmental windows they did not have access to, and again, you're running into ethical issues here. What are you going to do? How are you going to access a baby in the womb and test the function of DNA in those tissues? But I think we have the same problem as we do in anatomy and physiology. Absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, and the absence of evidence is from absence of experimentation. To me, what the ENCODE project suggests is a trajectory that is pointing towards increasing levels of function. We won't know if that trajectory holds up or not, but it looks to me like the evidence is pointing towards high levels of function in human DNA. And again, that's what it looks like to me. That's a hypothesis that's testable. And I anticipate then that as that level, the evidence for function goes up, the arguments then will have to necessarily change. And let me just pick one example real fast for sake of time. This is the ENCODE project. I'll skip that again. There's a study of pseudogenes. So you can see in the name pseudogene, even in the name itself, it sounds like this was a gene that once was and no longer is. It used to be a gene. It's broken. Well, the ENCODE project studied basically every single letter in the human DNA sequence. And since there's pseudogenes in the human DNA sequence, it's no surprise these were studied as well. Well, similar experiments have been done in other species, including worms and fruit flies. And the pseudogenes in these species have also been investigated biochemically for function. And not surprisingly, the number of human pseudogenes that have at least preliminary biochemical evidence for function mirrors what you see across the entire genome, about 80%. And similar numbers, 70-ish% in worms and flies, also hold true. Again, this is not genetic knockout experiments. It's not the gold standard. But it does set a trajectory. I don't think the evolutionists anticipated this sort of thing.
The fact that, phylogenetic systematics, as you're talking about here, it's mostly based on the concept of outdated junk DNA. So since, functions are only beginning to be found, say during the last decade, meaning we actually understand less than 5% of the DNA language, the trajectory, and I will also say that a lot of the data is preliminary, but the trajectory is most important. It strongly suggests that the vast majority of DNA will be functional. Now, why that does not bode well for phylogenetic systematics is because this takes away the primary assumption of evolutionary phylogenetics, which is actually based on mutations for one and pseudogenes, right? Genetic markers. But if the vast majority of DNA is functional, as we're seeing now, Godless Galaxy, it now becomes a common design argument. And what's nice and revealing is that creationists have always predicted that the vast majority of DNA is functional. So this functionality is certainly a problem and inconsistency for phylogenetic systematics. What do you think?
So you're saying that because we do not completely understand each function of DNA, that's like one of the reasons why we can't use phylogenetics?
Well, because a lot of these, phylogenetic trees, they're based on genetic markers that are assumed to be, mutation related, or let's use pseudogenes, for example, plagiarized mistakes or what they would call them, right? And if they really are plagiarized mistakes, that would certainly be strong evidence for universal common ancestry. But in regards to the ENCODE project, they found out that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was actually transcribed into RNA, right? So that actually suggests function, but it's also been found that these non-coding regions, and most of our genome is actually non-protein coding, I'm sure you're aware of that, but it's now known that these regions of genomes correlate with biological complexity even better than the protein coding regions. So that actually suggests that these non-coding regions, Godless Galaxy, they carry significant information, say for regulatory activity. But a big thing as well as ENCODE, they didn't look at the portions of the genome involved primarily and exclusively in development. So that type of DNA would only have function then. So that means the trajectory of discovery favors genome-wide functionality very strongly. Probably, there's certainly a lot more function in the genome than evolutionists formally assumed. But the point is if these genetic markers are actually functional DNA differences, they can't be used as plagiarized mistakes to build these phylogenetic trees. That's the point, you know what I mean? That's the point. So now these trees just remain in the realm of hypotheses. Right now, that's why the battle, rages on. Did ENCODE really detect function, or is it just spurious transcription? But if it really is function, once again, genetics points to common design. Do you understand what I just said there?
Sort of. So you're saying because these markers, they will claim to be mistakes or whatever, but that's a way to disprove evolution?
Well, because a prediction based on, pre-existing heterozygosity would be that the non-coding regions or functional. Okay, but evolution says that there will be much non-functionality. So they use a lot of those, say, pseudo genes, which are actually in those areas, as genetic markers to build their trees. But like I said, in regards to ENCODE, the ENCODE project, these results have suggested that at least 80% of the human genome is functional. But as I said, is the results are preliminary. Right? I've talked to scientists on this. I wouldn't want to straw man the.
Matt, I listened to Stand Up for Truth. I know his arguments. He doesn't understand the problem with heterozygosity.
One last question.
So you believe in Noah's Ark, and there is a certain number of kinds on Noah's Ark. I'd guess probably around 7,000, just to throw a number out. And right now, there's currently about 6.5 million species of animals that live on land. That means that approximately 4 species would have to be created every single day. Which, by species, I just mean about like several 100,000 differences in the genetic code. So, is that an accurate representation of your theory, that you believe that there are a certain number of kinds on the Ark, like 7,000, and there's currently about 6.5 million estimated species?
Are you asking me how can you get that amount of species in 4,000 years?
Right, because there'd have to be at least like 10,000 differences per day.
Yeah, I actually, that was a big portion of my opening with the created heterozygosity hypothesis. If you've got these heterozygous ancestors that God encoded with these pre-existing functional DNA differences, because we know there's millions and millions of DNA differences, nuclear DNA differences that separate species and families. So if those are encoded by God at the start of their existence, an almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are actually possible. So when you look to that model, we don't just look to mutations there, Tom. We look to recombination, gene conversion. They're going to provide many new varieties of these combinations of traits that I'm talking about quickly, since the differences are already built in. So it makes testable, falsifiable predictions that I've talked about earlier.
My question was a little bit different. I was asking because in order to account for those species, you would need to have 4 new species every day. And a new species, I'm simply just defining it as something that has hundreds of thousands of genetic differences, which means in order to account for these new species, you need hundreds of thousands of differences every day. Your theory seems to have a much greater evolution than ours.
I just don't think you understand what I mean by built-in genetic differences. There's millions of DNA differences in the nuclear DNA. So if these were built in at creation, created heterozygosity hypothesis, obviously through recombination and gene conversion, these new traits, new species would come about quickly, especially post-creation, immediate post-creation, post-flood.
I think you're saying that it's pre-programmed, that the species are pre-programmed into the DNA?
The genetic diversity is pre-programmed. Actually, there's a paper out. I would recommend you look at it. It's a fulfilled prediction from, based on the created heterozygosity hypothesis. It's about finches, because we predict shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. Right, heterozygous DNA sites to more homozygous DNA sites would produce new species quickly, even in observed time. So we've seen just recently, observed time, new finch species came about through shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. So because we've just studied speciation and speciation events recently, the more that we do study, that's another testable prediction. There's going to be more observed cases like these finches, many more. But the thing is, it has slowed down since the flood. So there's certain rates, mutation rates, predictions have been made. I would just tell people to read Replacing Darwin, very, very complex technical book, but it's all there. It's very fascinating.
In Psalm chapter 62, it says, "They only consult to cast him down from his excellency. They delight in lies." And in this series, we are covering some of the lies in the textbooks. Now, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I really don't, okay? I'm trying to help. But you were lied to. There is no Easter bunny, okay? I'm sorry. There isn't an Easter bunny. I'm sorry. You were lied to. There is no Santa Claus. And reindeers can't fly. They lied to you, okay? And you were lied to. Superman can't fly either, all right? And you were lied to. You can't fly either just by putting on your underwear outside of your pants, okay? That will not make you fly, okay? And Batman can't fly either just by putting his underwear over his pants and putting his blankie on his shoulders. That doesn't make him fly, folks. It's called imagination, SpongeBob stuff. And there never was a race between the tortoise and the hare. It's a story, a made-up story. You were lied to. There never was a purple hairy dragon that could make himself invisible. Pete's dragon it's a lie. It didn't happen. Most of the fairy tales, I'm sorry, There never was a purple genie in a bottle that sounded like Robin Williams either. It's just a lie. Now, put your mommy's red towel back in the drawer and take the red underwear off and your red socks off before your neighbors see you. You are a big boy now, and it's time to stop pretending. Okay? There are some lies in the textbooks that we're going to cover, and it's time to stop pretending that these things are true. They're not. Grand Canyon was not formed slowly over millions of years. That's the first lie we covered. There is no fossil record. That's a lie we covered. There are lots of fossils, but it's not a record. It's a bunch of bones in the dirt. You were lied to. The fossils do not show any evolution at all. None. How could they? All you know is it died. You found a bone in the dirt. You know it died. You don't know it had any children. In an honest court of law, not one single fossil would last 1/2 second as evidence for anything other than it died. Quit using that as evidence for evolution. It's dumb. Adding time won't help. I'm sorry, you were lied to. Someone told you that over billions of years the frog can turn to the prince. They lied to you, okay? Stop. Wake up. You're a big boy now. Face the facts. It's a lie. Adding energy won't help. It's not going to cure the problem that evolution has. The present is not the key to the past. Catastrophes change things rapidly. The Bible says they're ignorant of the flood. That flood rearranged the real estate big time. Yeah, really big time. You were lied to. There is no geologic column. It doesn't exist. The whole thing is imagination. It's a bunch of fossils somebody stuck in order to try to make their theory true. You were lied to. You're a big boy now. Get the blankie off your back and look at the facts. The flood did this, not millions of years of evolution. They say, one thing we've learned by studying fossils is organisms are constantly changing or evolving. That you can't be more stupid than that. You can't study fossils and see that organisms are changing or evolving. None of those fossils talk. None of them have a date stamped on them. None of them have a tag with them telling anything about them. You're putting your interpretation on them. They're not showing any change over history. You're making this up. Okay? Quit imagining. There is no Santa Claus. There is no Easter Bunny. And there are no fossils that show evidence of evolution. Wake up. Okay? Scientists use index fossils to determine the age of rock layers. This is flat dumb, okay? Index fossils do not determine the age of anything. The whole thing is a lie. There are no index fossils. We covered that a couple nights ago. Nobody went to jail for teaching evolution. This is a lie. And there are no laws against teaching creation or the Bible. This is simply a lie. You can teach it if you want. The lobe-finned fish like the coelacanth is not an index fossil. That's a lie. They're still alive. And stop pretending your grandpa was an ape-like creature. It's time to face the truth like a big boy. There is a God, and it's not you. Stop pretending your grandpa was a protozoa. You're embarrassing me in front of the neighbors. Okay? Stop. Stop pretending. It didn't happen. None of this happened. You drew a bunch of lines on paper, and that is somehow evidence. Think about that for 5 minutes. You got lied to by somebody. You came from soup. And the soup came from the rocks that got rained on and dissolved. Yes, you teach you came from a rock. Stop lying and say you don't believe that. Admit it and show some respect, for heaven's sake. Why do you walk on them on your sidewalk? This is your ancestor. Don't you have any respect whatsoever? You mix them up with cement and flatten them out and drive on them with your car. How disrespectful can you get to your ancestors? Gee.
Hey, Aaron, just an FYI, the paper Standing for Truth uses all of this for its BS. It was written by a young earth creationist named John Sanford. It's hilarious to read, published on Biomed.
Sanford's genomic entropy theory. It's crap.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Stanford. First of all, I just want to thank you for having your talk. I'm involved in a fairly significant group, and your work comes up quite often. My question is a bit of a two-parter. First, you stated that there was 700 billion new mutations per generation, correct? At a genome size of 3 billion, wouldn't we, for simplicity's sake, sticking with point mutations, have flipped every single mutation possible multiple times over?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
basically every possible mutation that could happen in the genome has happened during our lifetime.
Great. And then you stated that most mutations are in the non-selectin range. Wouldn't at some point you reach an equilibrium where the deleterious mutations flip and return to the previous state?
So flipping of back mutations are really rare. So you'd have your weight, basically the new mutations are flooding in, back mutations are exceedingly rare events, and so it'd be just as if there was no back. There is back mutation, but it wouldn't stem the tide.
Thank you.
I wonder whether I got that right. You're arguing that the baby differs from both parents by 100 nucleotides.
Yeah, 50 from each parent.
What is actually the experimental evidence for that? We do next generation sequencing and everything, so one could test that today. Is there evidence for that?
Yes, so I think most of the data is coming from parent-child trios, and so they're actually doing sequencing of parent and child, and so they actually can count the mutations. There are parts of the genome where they're not countable, like in tandem repeats and things, so they make some adjustment for that. But the 100 mutations per person per generation now is widely being circulated as the actual mutation rate. What fraction is neutral is debatable. Yes?
So have you ever considered a situation with some invertebrate species like horseshoe crabs that have been around for a long time into the geological record? How does a species like that continue to exist?
It's really a great question. Kondrashov actually talks about that. He said these lineages should have a lifespan limit. And so one author I didn't include was Dr. Fred Hoyle, a famous physicist. He actually was so interested in this that he spent a few years of his life looking at the mathematics of evolution. And he concluded DNA is degrading, and he said any given piece of DNA has a limited shelf life, basically. And so he envisioned aliens coming and reseeding the planet periodically to make up for all the degenerated genome. So, so really, it's hard to imagine deep time lineages surviving unchanged like the horseshoe crab. It's really a conceptual hurdle. And it's, I think, should be acknowledged widely that how, if current, so one really interesting thing, jumping to the virus issue, is we watched the H1N1 virus go from a red-hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in 90 years. There's a paper recently published that say that all RNA viruses of all different families appear to be evolutionarily young, meaning tens of thousands of years old. Whereas you'd think that viruses would date back to millions or billions of years ago. And so it's really interesting. The time element is something I don't want to deal with. I just want to deal with the present.
I'm wondering what your starting point is, because you're talking about genetic degeneration in humans. What is the point where you're starting from? Like, what's the point where, I'm just curious, because you have a continuity of humans coming from some ancestor that we wouldn't consider human. What is the point that you're starting from which
So the starting point, that's a good question. Basically, if we start with a population with 0 mutations, there is a burn-in time where it has to reach equilibrium, where it takes time for enough genetic diversity to build up in a 0 population, a 0 mutation population. And so there is a time where it's unrealistic, the degeneration rate is unrealistically high. And so we acknowledge that. But we could start anywhere. So we could start, let's suppose that all of the human beings in the world disappeared except the people in this room. We could start and say, okay, the average fitness in this room is 1. And then we're going to monitor fitness, not as reproduction, because that's a circular argument. We monitor fitness by function, like IQ or physical strength or things like, or longevity Those things are a better way to measure it. But it's a great question, and it is a part of the formulation. We do start with mutations with zero. We start our populations with 0, and so that's a factor. But we can restart a population once you've reached an equilibrium, a burn-in point, and we still see decline.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was just wondering, the mutational load is, as you say, is very high, but there's a lot of redundancy in the function of the human genome, and I'm just wondering if anybody has looked at it from that perspective, that there are similar functions. So maybe a particular mutation may take out one key gene, but there are redundant systems that can actually take over that function.
Yes, so that gets in a little bit into the philosophy element, because it looks to me, and a lot of people, like the genome is designed to be stabilized by things like diploidy, or things like gene family backups, or other types of redundancy. So redundancy does, in modern design, engineering design, we look at redundancy as a really good thing, and it is a good thing for our genome. And it's interesting because how do you evolve processes that only have long-term effects? Normally, selection can only act upon things are short. Beneficial mutations have normally a short-term vision of where they're going, so to speak.
It's also kind of a two-part question. The first thing is about formulations from Fisher, right, and the early on population geneticists. So those are incredibly useful and formal, but they're also extremely simplistic. They assume, as you're assuming still, like 100 years later, that fitness is just one-dimensional feature, and that the function of selection is to increase fitness, when it's probably this multidimensional feature, and that the function of selection would be to maintain the ability to adapt and not increase fitness. That's just the construct that was used mathematically to formalize this.
Right.
And this will lead to the second part, which is the equation should be, as was mentioned, for other species, correct? So for bacteria, for instance, and this has been studied, so this could be looked at. If your predictions are right, this should be observed in bacterial populations. They should collapse after a little bit of measurable amount of time in the lab, because they go through a lot of generations, and you can measure more accurately the distribution of mutations and the number of generations, and even sequence everything and see the predictions. But that doesn't seem to happen.
Okay, those are all really good points. Let's see if I can remember what they were. The first one was oftentimes it's not about gain in fitness, but adaptation.
Right.
I totally agree. Adaptive mutations are real. We can document them. They have value, but they don't necessarily increase net information. So I look at adaptation mutations mostly as fine-tuning systems. And so in a sense, adaptations let a species remain the species because the species can accommodate changing environments. The second issue you brought up was multidimensional. I totally agree that the typical population genetics formulas are crazily oversimplified. The reason we went to numerical simulation is we call our numerical simulations comprehensive, because we try to consider all the variables, and rather than just like a lot of in the past, numerical simulations only simulate some part of evolutionary process, or like, let's say, the rate of drift or the rate of and they often have simplifying assumptions like truncation selection or no environmental variance, things like that. So to do good numerical simulations, you have to consider like 30 parameters, and they're all adjustable. But you can look at a wide range of possibilities, but you realize that you can't reduce this to a formula. And so I agree with that. Your last point was?
Yeah, exactly that point. If you can't reduce it to a formula, you can't model realistic systems. And then when you look at systems like bacteria, where this is not happening, for instance, so I was talking about bacteria. which
Right.
relates
Okay,
to
so
that
the
point.
bacteria is also a good question. So I recently read a paper about reductive evolution in bacteria, and the long-term E. coli experiment also reflects this, is bacteria rapidly adapt to a new medium or a new environment. And that's really interesting. It's an adaptation. They're not gaining any new function. All those experiments usually actually involve reductive evolution. For example, all of the beneficial mutations in the long-term Lenski experiment were loss of function. Genes were deleted, genes were silenced, or genes were downregulated. So in one case, a promoter, which is normally regulated, became an unregulated promoter. But all that is adaptive fine-tuning. There was no new information being created. And in fact, technically, as the bacteria jettisons unnecessary genes for that environment, they are actually painting themselves into a corner. They won't be able to survive in any other environment. So they become handicapped in a sense. So there's another paper on reductive evolution in bacteria where they say, they were looking at a specific bacteria. They said 1/3 of all random deletions increased fitness. It has to do with getting rid of any genes that aren't necessary for the moment. It's very short term. The bacteria, it works for them short term, but then when they need those genes that they've jettisoned, they don't have them. So that's even that, in my opinion, that type of adaptation is entropic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for such a provocative talk where you give us the thesis that according to current biological paradigms, we don't exist. But my question is so much of that thesis hinges on a simple piece of evidence that we don't have a normal distribution of deleterious and beneficial mutations. And my question really is, how can we empirically test this when we can only look to the past and present and we actually don't know the future of mutations?
A number of geneticists have tried to quantitate the actual distribution of mutations. It's actually hard to quantify the near neutrals because they're so neutral that you can't see the effect. And so there is a certain amount of assumption there. Let's see, lost my train of thought. Your question was, how can we know the distribution of mutations?
Sure.
And so Lenski's experiment is really interesting because they were periodically sequencing the population as it changed, they could actually determine exactly, and they could determine when mutations arose. They could see which mutations were beneficial. Only a tiny fraction were beneficial, and they were all reductive. So that's a quantitative thing. Also, we did a research on the influenza virus. So Rob Carter and I, turns out that over the last 70 years or so, medical people have been freezing influenza samples. And then all those samples through history were sequenced. So we have this historical sequence, kind of like the Lenski situation, but with influenza. And what we see is that, well, actually, let me just show a slide here. This is our numerical simulation. Mutation goes up perfectly linearly, and fitness goes down with a fitness decline curve. And this is the influenza study that we did. Rob gathered sequence data going back to the 30s, and what he sees is a strict linear accumulation, just in the same way. So basically, it's clock-like. 10% of the H1N1 influenza virus mutated. And so this is genetic entropy at work, and it's supported by other people who have been following H1N1's virulence, and they show that the decline since again records were being kept, or actually since the 1918 influenza, is that the virulence declined in the same type of way that we see in our simulations, to the point where in 2009, that human version of H1N1, there's still H1N1 circulating that's swine flu, but H1N1 went extinct in 2009. So that's clearly indicating that this is not neutral or adaptive. This is genetic entropy at work in a biological system where we can measure what's going on. There were mutations, by the way, there was some adaptation. There were some beneficial mutations happening, but it wasn't enough to stop extinction. And these two other curves were two other influenza outbreaks, and they similarly underwent entropic decay. They didn't go extinct yet, but they're clearly headed that way. So we do have some biological data.
Okay.
Well,
thank you.
It's true that it's largely theoretical, but there's now growing biological data.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you showing up, and I know I've taken too much time. I have a few books that I'm happy to share with you, one genetic entropy and one on contested bones. If you think you're going to read it, you're welcome to a copy. The BINP, Biological Information, New Perspectives, that proceedings is in the NIH library, and you can. But you don't want to read that proceedings. It would take you a few months. It's 25 really long papers, very technical, on all the different dimensions to biological information. But there's like a synopsis you can read in a few hours, which is freely available at BINP.org. It stands for Biological Information New Perspectives.org. And there you can download the synopsis for free. So if that interests you, that's available. But thank you so much for your patience.
Matt, I listened to Stand Up for Truth. I know his arguments. Kumara's theory to resolve that dilemma. He doesn't understand any of this.
Now, a lot of evolutionists will say, oh, genetic entropy has been refuted, but it has not. And when you look at rebuttals from evolutionists, whether it's Paulogia, whether it's a certain blog on the internet, letters to creationists, when fighting this truth, what the rebuttal will be, they'll speak of the obvious. Beneficials do happen. Selection does happen. Adaptation does happen. No one's disagreeing with this. Anybody with a basic understanding of genetics understands and knows these things. The argument of genetic entropy, genome degradation, only begins after acknowledging these obvious things. So let's look at some of the objections to genetic entropy. A lot of time they'll spend, and I know Jackson, we spent a lot of time saying that John Sanford misrepresented the data, misrepresented Camorra, but this is a rabbit trail. If you're looking at the slide here, John Sanford shows a larger zone of no selection than does Camorra because Camorra's analysis of the problem was oversimplified. The crucial issue is about defining the correct distribution of mutation effects. The vast majority of beneficials will be unselectable. Anybody can easily see that most mutations fall within the no selection zone and that almost all of them are deleterious. So even with strong selection, the entire zone can only undergo degeneration. Now, they'll appeal to beneficial mutations. That's what it comes down to. But due to the influx of deleterious mutations, the rare occurrence of beneficial mutations cannot compensate for the information loss. Beneficial mutations are very rare. Even evolutionists agree to this. And near neutral mutations are continuously and consistently deleterious, just as you would expect with typographical errors in a text. Most beneficial mutations are too subtle to be selected for by natural selection.
Neffy says he wants to have a debate with me, but what he really wants to do is just get in a video hangout where he can, I don't know, yell over me or something.
Yell over you? What? That is basically what you did to me on every single comment or question. Look.
Even argues that our knowledge of molecular processes is not good enough to ever determine or rule out independent origins. So it's telling us that things like density of hair that they have to protecting them from all elements. They don't get sunburned.
Hold on.
Let me know what you think.
Excuse me.
Now lost their bees, and now they now have to pollinate by hand.
Except that they are not.
Oh, this thing can't do that thing, then that's unfalsifiable and not science.
No, Matt,
well, hold on. Something is a mammal, but if you want to play by the taxonomic rules, that is very, very strong. They have twice as much density.
Yeah, they do have very, very strong muscles.
Information we're talking about, it would have to be some kind of a gain.
Then we have to get into
pretty recently.
Okay, never mind. These questions.
And humans are just
no,
apes.
It's not.
Have outdoor allergies. They never fail, and they have far better hearing. They have far better color vision.
They do have those things.
things all the time. This is genetic breakdown. This is
But we gain
degradation,
benefits
genomic
too.
Can you
deterioration.
explain?
We're not powerful jaw. Look at their immunity. They're immune to
Yeah,
almost
they're all
infection.
identical.
Other species as well. But when these genes mutate,
But
because
that
they have the same, if evolution was true, they wouldn't have function because they evolved.
No,
They are human beings so far long ago.
you can get
No,
you gain
evolution.
At a certain stage, that's all. We believe in macroevolution. It just finishes when
book,
things.
No, hang on.
They're just saying
Even
it
when they
because
know it's wrong.
even they say they don't know, and
What are you
there's too
talking
much
about? They
noise
don't
at the
know
end of
what?
these
What?
branches.
0% of what?
Clear definition of what a species is. Now you can't blather
Okay,
on
so
about
stop.
His videos constantly says
I know Kent
that
Hovind lies again.
the longer they spend their time in the
What?
ocean, the less they need
What
a shell.
turtle?
Well, the turtle. It's still a turtle.
But there's- how many species of turtle? Do you have any idea how many species?
not there, and to find results.
Whoa.
Like that. I think their understanding of macroevolution is a new morphological feature
Straw man. It's a straw man distortion of.
by 99.9%. What are the
What are
odds
the
that
odds?
that human beings have
no,
three
we're not going to do this.
even argues that our knowledge of molecular processes is not good enough to ever determine or rule out independent origins. So it's telling us that things apply.
How about each other? Will they interrupt each other when they talk? Let's see.
And they are what he would say colloquial, the groupage, and they could be monophyletic or paraphyletic.
Oh wow, look at that, respectful, amazing. Watch some more, shall we?
All right, Aaron.
Well,
do you have
once
anything
again,
that
no. I always have a good time. It's really the explanation is boring.
Shannon would be really good to do it with something with that along those lines.
maybe?
10 if you're old like me. Be awesome.
And then, of course,
and guys,
weekend after that, I'll be back in. So, will you admit?
Matt, listen very carefully. That would be pre-Cambrian.
Okay, and I'm gonna send this to
And
David.
those are
unknown, so that you can see this on the screen. And
monkey drunk.
I feel like this is gonna replace the Sphinx guy. That thing.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Aaron, can you answer that about the bat?
Apply to the same clade.
Yes.
The colloquial word ape conforms to the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea, which means ape.
And we're Hominoidea.
Back in SpongeBob La La Land.
Okay, there you are.
Nat, how we doing, brother? Are we live right now?
Yes, we're live.
All right, sweet. So starting fresh. You know what? For anybody who's just joining and didn't hear anything from before, I think we should go over a few things that took place on NonSequitur show tonight with you and a few of the atheists, actually.
Yeah, so I'm just sharing the link, making sure I've done everything I can real quick before I get into a discussion of this thing. With what happened, transpired. Let me see. I've shared the link to the watch page, and I guess that's all I need to do right now. So
yeah, you should.
We're good to go.
Now
I want to check my YouTube channel and see if it's actually showing up. It
is. I just checked.
Okay, cool. Good.
So you're good. We're good.
Yep, it is. There it is.
So I want to say, awesome job tonight, Neff. You went in there, short notice. At the end of the day, you were supposed to debate. I can't even remember what his name was, but
I don't either.
You dismantled his arguments. Steve had to jump in and come to the rescue. He knew that evolution was being exposed on his precious NonSequitur channel with over 800 people watching. Then you were dismantling his arguments, and then he had to bring in a biologist. He had to bring in Cy, and it all ended with Aaron Ra coming in and not really providing anything of substance, but just cursing and being derogative and slandering. So he didn't contribute anything.
Yeah, so this is a synopsis for anybody listening or that comes to listen, doesn't know what happened. I went to watch the Kent Hovind debate with this other fellow. And there was a scheduling problem, a mix-up somehow. They discovered after a few minutes into the thing, Kent Hovind wasn't going to be able to join and actually debate. So they invited me into it. It was Steve McRae, the fellow that was to debate Hovind, and another fellow that I don't know. And so I entered and started debating, debated that fella and knocked down all of his assertions. And then Steve McRae jumps in to try to help fix the problem, and I knocked down his assertions. So then they brought in a PhD biologist, and I knocked down his assertions. And then, so at the last minute, 8 minutes or I think it was before the hangout ends, Aaron Ra jumps in and starts inebriated, quite inebriated, cussing like crazy, using filthy language and personally insulting me in a number of ways, and and then says that he's willing to debate me, because and I said, well, I said, great, okay, I'll do it. But I was about to leave because I was sick of hearing his vulgarity and his insults. That's not what I go in hangouts for. But so I asked him, I said, well, he said, we can do it right now. And I said, okay, great. We just need a moderator. When are you guys going to moderate? And it would be just me and Aaron Ra. And the other fellow said that he would do it. But then they say, oh, wait a minute, the show ends in 8 minutes and we have to start another one. We're scheduled to do another show right after. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I told Aaron Ra, I said, well, Aaron Ra, I'm having a hangout immediately after this one. I'd be happy for you to join that one, and I'll have a moderator, and you can debate me there. And then he said, well, who's going to moderate? And I said, well, I said, Standing for Truth will do so. He's a friend of mine. And he said, you can't have somebody who's a Christian or a creationist or whatever, blah, 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 as a moderator, blah. So his excuse for not doing it was that he was, somehow, apparently, as a creationist, you're going to be so disingenuous as a moderator, you can't be trusted as moderator, and that's his excuse for not doing it. And that was just pretty lame. That was really lame. So I think all Aaron Ra did was demonstrate that he actually does fear debating me. And he showed up at the last minute. It was damage control, try to protect himself, because many people have known, and his friends as well, and his atheist buddies, evolutionist friends, that I've had an open challenge to debate Aaron Ra for about 9 or 10 years going, and he has refused to accept. And so he wants to save face and make it look like that's not the case. He's always been willing to debate me. And so he pops in 8 minutes before the show is about to end, knowing that it's going to end and they don't have time for us to debate anyway. So I offered for us to debate in a hangout of mine, which I was already going to have, with a moderator, and suddenly he's not willing to do it because apparently the moderator can't be trusted. I mean, how lame can you get, really? Please.
Well, it's nothing but excuses, obviously, and it's not like you had a problem with going on a Non-Sequitur show to debate, a one-on-one, and it turned out to be 4-on-1, but yet he wants to complain because a fellow creationist is going to be the one who moderates. I mean, nothing but excuses. Nobody believes it. Nobody buys it. Matt, did you get to listen to most of that, brother?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, that was entertaining.
Yeah, what'd you think of that? Give us your thoughts. Give us your review.
I wish Jeremy was there. That would have been fun. But
oh, he was on the sidelines. He was
really.
I got to hear his comments. That was fun. He didn't have many nice things to say. We know how triggered he gets, and we love it for it.
Right. That was good. I enjoyed it. It was interesting. They were throwing questions were just kind of open. They were in the air, so anybody could say anything. That was always nice. It was kind of random, but that's good. That's kind of how debates sometimes go. I don't know what happened to Kent Hovind. I guess he had lined up.
He's debating tomorrow night at 8.
Right. Yeah.
So they rescheduled it for whatever reason. But to be honest with you, Kent Hovind doesn't owe Non-Sequitur show anything. He's blessed them with his appearance. How many times? 5 times. And each time they got, thousands and thousands of views. The Aaron Ra, over 350,000 views. But they do nothing but slander him, scoff at him. So, you know what? They're going to do it on his time as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of funny how they say, yeah, they don't want you moderating because you're a Christian, right? But they say their show's fine, but it's completely secular. They're all atheists.
Oh, exactly.
Okay.
That's why I say, you know what, I want to support James and his modern day debate channel. And I talked to James privately, and Neff and myself, we're gonna help his channel grow by really just debating any evolutionist on his channel. And he's a very unbiased, fair moderator. He's not like the guys on NonSequitur show. So I know for myself, I'd personally rather go on Modern Day Debates channel and debate there than to go on NonSequitur and allow it to turn into a 4-on-1 like it did tonight. Even though it was a complete success, it showed the strength of young Earth creation, and Neff just destroyed their arguments one by one.
Yeah, yeah.
I would want to talk for a second about inviting people in here. You know that some atheists will porn bomb your hangout and ruin it. And so I worry about that, because the last time I think I was in a hangout and a friend of mine said, yeah, I think I can trust this guy. It was another fellow. It's not one of you guys. I can trust this guy. I can vouch for him. And he shared the link to join with the guy. And sure enough, he porn bombed the hangout. So if you don't know for sure that you can trust somebody, don't invite him.
Yeah, that's a good point, Neff. That's a good point. I do want to mention one thing about the debate that stood out. So Steve McRae, he came in to rescue. And you know what? You started shutting down his arguments very fast, and his arguments were horrible. Like, we kind of talked about this in the other video, but I want people to know that to not be tricked by his strategy. He thinks just talking about basic genetics, so saying things like, evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over time, and DNA means deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's made of nucleotides, ATCG, and talking about inheritance and just things that we all understand, non-protein coding genes, protein coding genes. And he thinks that he's actually proving a point. And Matt, you made a great rebuttal where you were like, you called him out for not answering the question directly, and you were absolutely right. He wasn't answering the question directly. He was talking about basic genetics, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and you made a good analogy to a car and how the evolutionist will explain the car. Hey, it comes in 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, 2.4 liter, push on the gas pedal and the pistons go and whatever, but he's not explaining anything to do with evolution itself. So he wasn't fooling me. It wasn't fooling you, and you called him out on it perfectly.
Yeah, evolutionists have a habit of that. They think that they can blind you with science and by simply describing things, especially if they can do so in more scientific terms. Oh, obviously he's right, because look, he can mention these words. So that's not an explanation for the answer to the question. They think that if they can describe a thing, the analogy I gave was a car in there.
Yeah.
And you pointed it out. Describing the car doesn't answer the question as to where it came from or how it came into being. Right. Or explain what the mechanism for the car coming into being. Just pointing out, well, it's got wheels, and see, there you go, and it has gas tank, and you put gas in, it's got a stereo, and you can turn it on or off. Okay, great, it has all that stuff. Now answer the question: how'd the car come into being again?
Exactly.
And they won't do that. They don't want to do that. So they pull this technique. They do it all the time. All the time. Of talking about something, especially the more technical the terminology they can use. They think that's giving an answer to the question, because they can't really give a logical or scientific answer to the question. They got to do something, so they resort to describing something as though that's giving an answer.
Well, like they start describing, natural selection. Natural selection is the process where organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. Boom, molecules to man, evolution proven. Like, that's literally their argument against you. And you called them out several times. Hey, you're not answering my question. Then they went on trying to explain mutations. And they really did no benefit to evolutionary theory. They had absolutely no argument.
Right, and I couldn't believe what I heard from Steve. I pointed out that I said, well, look, Steve, natural selection is a selection process. It doesn't generate anything. It just spreads what already exists. You have to have the change for natural selection to select and pass on. So natural selection isn't a creative process. It's simply a passing on process. And he said, no, that's not true. It is creating. What? Somebody needs to wake Steve McRae up and explain to him that natural selection is not a creative process. It only participates in the creation of something new, novel, in evolutionary thinking, but there has to be the change first for natural selection to pass it on. Natural selection creates nothing. It only preserves what already exists. That was an absolutely ridiculous thing for Steve to say.
Well, here's the thing, biological evolution, we all agree, means a change in allele frequency in populations over time or over generations. And as I said before, Neff, that type of microevolutionary variation, and we don't exactly like the term, but, we'll use it anyways. The evolutionists have hijacked it. But that change in the frequency of the expression of these different traits, we're not arguing, we're not disputing with that. And you correctly pointed out that that type of evolution explains, the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. How in the world is that type of small scale variation going to explain the major innovations, the origin of, new forms of life, anatomical novelty, phenotypic complexity? And they just wouldn't answer any of that. Steve McRae just kept going back to change in allele frequency over time, change in allele frequency over time. Like, we get it, buddy. Yeah. No one's disagreeing with that.
Right. Nobody argues that changes to allele frequency don't happen. The truth is, changes to allele frequency over time in a population actually causes a loss of genetic information because it makes genes recessive, gets them turned off epigenetically. After enough generations, the gene can never be expressed again. It will never be turned back on again, or except in rare cases, maybe. For the most part, it's off, and none of the members of that community will get the information expressed. On a rare occasion, it can happen that it'll be expressed, but for the vast majority of individuals in a population, that information is just turned off. It's gone. It's not going to be expressed. So that's a loss of genetic information. Evolution portends to explain the arrival of new genetic information, not losing it. You can't get the trunk of an elephant by turning off information. You don't get the stinger in the tail of a scorpion by turning off information. You have to have new information to get new features that don't exist in the prior creature. So changes to allele frequency don't help the evolutionist at all. And you can explain that to them, and they just act like they can't see that. It's got to be true somehow. It's weird. Anyway, Matt, jump in anytime you want to talk about something. Don't wait for a long pause or anything. Just
actually,
if you got something you want to say.
No, I think a good thing for Matt to talk about, because Matt really understands epigenetic regulation really good. And the example he was using, and you calling him out on epigenetics and epigenetic changes, not actually demonstrating the type of large scale evolution that they need. Matt, what did you think about that, brother?
Oh, well, they just assumed that it was everything's just beneficial mutation still. They're not up to date on epigenetics, so there's you can't blame them for that. They still are latching onto the old material. They really haven't updated it yet. Once they realize that, they're in big trouble once they look at genetic similarity as well. I even posted that to Ken Hovind the other day. I said, look, they've even stated directly that if common ancestry is true, then apes will match us more genetically than they do any other species. And I gave them 4 examples yesterday of a cat, a dog, a pig, and a mice that all have more genes similar to us than they do. So that itself deflates their theory right there.
That's excellent. I just discovered R and Oz in the discussion on the watch page there, and I asked him again, as I did in the hangout that we just came from, if he would like to join and debate me, as he said he would in the other hangout when he came in 8 minutes before it shut down, if he would like to debate with a moderator. And let's see what his response is this time. The last time it was that apparently my moderator can't be trusted, I guess. He says, I saw your worthless video that didn't disprove my phylogeny challenge at all. You just complained about it. Well, come in and debate me about that.
I made
That's
3.
what he just said in the was he talking to you, Matt?
Yeah, he's talking my first video. Of course, it didn't debunk it. It was because it was the first challenge that he was putting forth as a creationist challenge, when I was directly saying that it was not a creationist problem, it's an evolutionary problem. That was the title of that video. So he obviously
Well, exactly. Video number 1 was proving how fallacious the challenge was. Video number 2, we actually went into the empirical evidence, not only debunking Pons come to people evolution, universal common descent, but actually addressing the phylogeny challenge and, what's related, what's not, how we can identify the borderline of created kinds. And then video 3 kind of summed it all up. So if he only watched video 1, then he's severely lacking really any of the finer details.
Yeah. Well, so I didn't see a response to Aaron Raw from Aaron Raw. I asked him, Aaron, would you like to would you like the link to join, and would you join, in the other hangout that we were just in? You said that you would debate me, but you came in 8 minutes before it shut down, and then you complained about my moderator. I don't know why you think my moderator can't be trusted.
He's drinking.
But anyway, so how about joining this one and in debating? You said you were willing in that hangout to debate. There wasn't time, of course. They were shutting it down to do another. So what do you think? You want to jump in here and debate me one-on-one? I'm quite sure that one of the gentlemen in here would be willing to be the moderator, and everybody else remain completely silent, be just you and me, and we have a moderator with a timer, and we could have our debate. What do you say? Willing to do that? I mean, you seemed all up for it in that other hangout, as though you were really geared up to do it, but I think you knew, didn't you, that there was only 8 minutes left there. But here's your chance, right?
Looks like he said when he gets home, he's not doing it now. Someone else is typing.
Okay. Oh, I see. I will when I return home. Okay. Well, I wonder when that will be. Maybe.
That explains why he's not so vulgar.
Somebody says this is a fake Aaron Raw. I wonder if that's true. I can check that by clicking go to channel from there. Yeah, that's a fake Aaron Raw. It's not actually him, because there's no content on that channel, so it's a fake one. It's not the real Aaron Raw. They're right.
Lame.
Yeah, there's it takes you to a YouTube channel with no content, and Aaron Raw's got hundreds and hundreds of videos, so that's not even Aaron Raw.
Yeah, Aaron, honestly, his knowledge in genetics lacks anyways, and like I was saying earlier, his entire phylogenetic systematics is based on some major false assumptions that we've addressed a million times. A lot of the pseudogenes he uses, a lot of the genetic markers they use, they've all been overturned. Junk DNA is dead, and the trajectory of discovery favors genome-wide functionality. So these DNA differences, this neutral variation that, well, for one, Dr. Mays talks about, is better explained under a biblical creation model of common design. So, I mean, his argument falls flat on its face.
I'll be back in just 1 minute, guys. Go ahead and keep talking. I have to do something real quick for my wife. I'll be right back.
All right.
Yeah, would you see? Isn't it funny, Matt, how they got to come in and like hyenas, right? They come in packs. So it starts off 1-on-1. McRae comes in 2-on-1. Cy comes in from BioLogos, and you know what? Cy's argument in regards to, well, he spent a great deal of time just explaining, mutations, natural selection, whatever it is, nothing we even disagree with. And he went on about bacteria and really gave no example or empirical data supporting evolutionary theory anyways. And supposedly that's supposed to be Steve McRae's go-to scientist. And everything he said was lacking, which is quite telling for how little evidence they actually have, because he should have been able to come in there and just rant off a bunch of solid facts demonstrating his pet theory, and he really couldn't do it at all. So at the end of the day, it was 4-on-1, and I think Neff handled himself quite well.
Yeah, I think so too, man. He, we bring up a lot of discussions when it comes to creationism. Unfortunately, people only see the topic as from one aspect. Creation, right? Because it's in a word, so they always assume that we're talking about abiogenesis. But most of the time, we talk about what the people want to talk about. So when we're talking about like evolution or change over time, okay, well, show the funguses or bacteria or yeast or viruses or parasites or anything, even pleomorphic organisms. Change, show them mutate into anything else in any known experiment, give them any temperature, give them any food, give them anything, and all they do are epigenetic changes. That's it.
Exactly.
They don't have any beneficial mutations whatsoever, and that's absolutely required by an astronomical amount of time and by multiple things to happen for it to occur, and it just never does.
Well, it's funny because when we do our talks, we can spend 2 hours giving data and evidence that's consistent with a biblical based model, and we'll go on and on about deleterious mutations, mutation related diseases, and they struggle to even give one solid example of an information adding mutation that can actually account for the net loss versus net gain. And how many times have we gone over their very best examples? For example, African resistance to malaria, but that's due to a broken hemoglobin protein. Gene duplications, we know that those are almost universally deleterious. And then even if you give them a few rare, say, beneficial duplications, common sense dictates that those are not going to be able to offset the many accumulating deleterious duplications, let alone all the other accumulating mutations. Their Milano mutation, loss of net specificity or epigenetic regulation with the antifreeze proteins in fish. So it's like they've got no evidence, no example. We'll go on and on and on about evidence for genomic degradation, not only in the genome, but also on a epigenetic level, like literally entropic degeneration on all levels. We'll go into it for hours, but yet you get someone like this scientist from BioLogos to come in, and he gets the floor for 3-4 minutes and provides no evidence. He goes on about bacteria. Well, let's look at the Lenski experiment. What do we see? Reductive evolution. We see their genome size has shrunk, and we see that the adaptation, the fine-tuning to this artificial environment was mainly accomplished by means of loss of function, loss of regulation, and a net loss of information. So it's like no actual evidence for their theory. It's hilarious.
Yeah, it must be disappointing. That's probably why they're so mad. They wouldn't worry about us at all if they weren't in trouble. If there was nothing to worry about, if evolution was completely true, we would be seeing it observed. And they always say, well, we can't see it, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. What are you talking about? It would be occurring right now all over the place. But they don't find the beneficial mutations that they need. They just thought they were. And now that they've unraveled the epigenetics, it's just falling between their fingertips. They're in big trouble.
Well, it's funny because there's a guy in the chat, and his name's Jay. He doesn't even know what evolutionary theory is anyways. I'm sure you can ask him to define evolution. I'm not sure if he even knows what a change in allele frequency in populations over time even is, but he keeps saying, show us the evidence, disproving evolution. That's not going to prove creation. Where's your evidence? It's like we go into, the 3 major haplogroups and how there's 3 independent lines of evidence that fit exactly what we see in mitochondrial DNA that is consistent with a biblical creation model. We go into genomic degradation, which we would expect after the fall, accumulation of deleterious mutations. We go into the fact that, what do we see? in humans. We see low genetic diversity, proving that we only came from, two people, Adam and Eve. That's exactly what we'd expect. We see one Y ancestor, one Y chromosome. We see one mitochondrial DNA, and then most genes come in two versions. So this is all consistent with Adam and Eve. And then we see Noah's flood points us right to only a few mitochondrial DNA lines, the Y chromosome line, and evidence of rapid population growth. So it's like, what more evidence do you need? That's all evidence for a biblical-based model. But then they'll just keep saying, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? It's like,
yeah,
you can go on and on for hours about it.
Yeah. I'll point out something about the argument the biologist that was in there with me said. He pointed to bacterial resistance. And so here's my thoughts about that. Bacterial resistance doesn't change the structural design of the bacteria one iota. So it doesn't move it towards becoming something other than a bacteria. So it can't possibly be, no matter what you believe, it cannot possibly be evidence for evolution, period. But the truth is that bacterial resistance is simply an organism expressing an ability they already possess. They already have an immune system, and they're simply expressing it because of something that they've encountered in their environment. They're not gaining anything new. They're expressing the very same system that they have, the immune system, which is based on somatic mutation, which is program mutation, and it's algorithmic. And evolution can't explain the existence of algorithms because they're non-physical fundamental entities produced only by intelligence. Chemistry cannot create algorithms. So that's one of the empirical evidences of intelligent design, is that living systems have genetic algorithms, algorithmic operations in their DNA. So gaining an immunity is a lousy example or argument from evolutionists, but they use these kinds of arguments because that's all they've got. They don't have any actual.
All they got, exactly.
They've got to say something, so they point to bacterial resistance, which is not evidence of evolution. And gaining these immunities actually weakens the organism. I'll remind everybody of Lenski's experiments. The 500th generation and the 5,000th generation, et cetera, of bacteria that he has been breeding in his experiment are all weaker and less fit than the 50,000th generation. So these are gaining immunities and constantly changing frequencies of alleles in the population of these bacteria. In the end, it does nothing but weaken the bacteria. When they're in often cases, gaining an immunity requires the damage to an existing gene. And if you doubt that's true, then I would refer you to Archaic Fossil Yield Resistant Bacteria, Medical Tribune, January 1988, page 1. I mean, this is not anything new. So you return the bacteria to their original environment, and they're weaker. Dr. Jonathan Sanford, retired Cornell University geneticist, inventor of the gene gun, author of Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, Ivan Press 2005, said this, quoting, "The resistant bacteria has not evolved. In fact, it has digressed genetically and is defective. Such a mutant strain is rapidly replaced by quote-unquote superior bacteria as soon as the antibiotic is removed."
Well, exactly right. And you can Google reductive evolution in bacteria, and it's actually a widely known fact that bacteria do experience reductive evolution. And even Lenski, what's happening, and Matt and I were talking about this earlier, a lot of these adaptations are due to loss of information, loss of promoter, loss of genes, loss of function. So it's still not going to take your fish to fisherman. And I always talk about functional DNA and how there's a strong trajectory for genome-wide functionality, which actually makes the problem of genetic entropy even worse. But there's a really important paper out now, which is funny because if you just don't feel like arguing, junk DNA, because these evolutionists are often science deniers. So they'll say, hey, it looks like a car, it drives like a car, but guys, it's not a car. They'll say silly things like this, but there's a paper now, rock solid paper, that's showing that if a substantial fraction of the human genome is functional, as I said, then this type of evolution macroevolution would not be possible, right? But in the paper, it shows that even if the genome was even 10% functional, so if you just want to give it to them and say, okay, the majority of our genome's junk, based on genomic degradation, the evolution of man would still be impossible, even if only 10% of our genome is functional. Based on mutation accumulation, 100 per person per generation, Pons come to people evolution is still impossible. Like, it's literally been falsified, but these evolutionists are science deniers. So they hold on to their pet theory regardless of the data. So that's why I always say it's a religion, because it takes faith to believe in something that's been falsified.
Oh yeah, I've given a paper that showed 22 falsifications of evolution, and then the ones that we've done, you know, with genetic degradation and showing that there's genetic similarities are totally bunk. So it threw away their phylogenetic trees. And basically, under our video, they don't post anything. They just are like, "That's stupid."
Yeah, exactly. Ad hominems.
Science is stupid. Oh my goodness, really?
Yeah, sure. It's great. 6-hour video to have it. Just that was the only comment, you know.
It's so funny. We go into like such significant detail, technical facts, disproving universal common ancestry, proving biblical creation, and it's flooded with atheist comments. Like Matt just said, you're dumb, you're stupid, you believe in a fairy tale. Like, as if that's going to make us kneel over and say, "Oh wow, you guys are right." It just makes us laugh and realize how wrong they really are.
Their arguments are empty. Evolutionists are incapable of seeing that everything that they put forth as an argument for how evolution occurs is a philosophical construct. It's part of their philosophy, but it's not observable, it's not demonstrable, it's not scientific. They refuse to accept that. What the evolutionist believes to be true is somehow science in their mind. It's got to be true because, hey, I believe in evolution, therefore it is true. And that's just not a scientific way of thinking. You can't, it's very difficult to get an evolutionist to recognize that what they're believing is philosophy, not science.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I'm just saying, you know, we just let the science kind of come out, and it proves that things for us. Remember, they thought the Earth was bombarded with meteors for eons and eons. Then they dig down there, and they find almost no meteors down in the deep soil. And then they go, well, it had to have happened, so I guess it was just volcanoes that did it. And they go, well, there obviously could have been no oxygen because left-handed amino acids can't actually create anything. So they invent an atmosphere that had no oxygen. Unfortunately, when they actually test the early rocks and everything, they actually find that it was full of oxygen, and it was Eden from the very beginning. So everything is just crumbling between their hands, like I was saying earlier. So just they're doing it for us. Actually, we can just sit back and watch now.
Actually, that's a really good point. Their very own data. Well, you can see how these evolutionary scientists argue amongst themselves, and you know, they propose all these different rescue mechanisms, rescue devices, say for something like even convergent evolution. They argue about abiogenesis when we know that's literally impossible. They've got great faith. I admire their zeal for their science fiction religion, but I don't admire their science, and they deny science.
Yeah, they must. I mean, you kind of have to, because really they don't have what's required for them to actually observe, witness, and test and repeat it. Kind of like with human language, you can test that theory out. You can say, well, can humans evolve language? Can they take no language and form it themselves? And they've never been able to. They try, because they have these people that never speak language, and even us with the ability to speak language can't teach these people after the age of puberty how to speak language. So they've proven that language can't evolve on its own. But yet,
right. Even Noam Chomsky acknowledged that the evolution of language from non-language has no plausible explanation.
Yeah, they only have 6 theories for it. And basically, it's either man grunted it into language existence, which is insanity. They copied what they saw from nature, and it formed language. Another one is they were banging sticks on something, and that's how they communicated, or they used sign language. And all of those have been falsified. They don't really have much, because human language, communication and language are entirely different things. We don't deny that things can communicate with one another, but linguistic-wise, we're talking about language, and human language formation is extremely impossible. And then when you get into it, they said that human language formed everywhere on Earth, so that makes it entirely improbable now.
Well, another problem is that all language requires a code. Even if it's nothing more than facial expressions, animals can communicate their thoughts or intent by the way that they look on their face, their facial expression. That is a code too. The way that the face is arranged into an expression is a code, and that's a symbol to the animal that they perceive as a particular attitude or intent. So there is no such thing as a language without a code. All languages require code. DNA is no different. DNA is a language and it has code. So codes arise from coders. They don't arise from random chance associations, happenstance associations of molecules. That's not even plausible. So you can't even explain the very code of DNA that creates exons and introns and ultimately genes, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs and chapters in a book of information called DNA without a code and without linguistics. And evolution can't produce either of those things. It's just impossible. They all come from intelligence. Every example of a code is produced by an intelligence. Every example of language is come forth from an and there's even intelligence in the simplest living creatures. And saying simple is, guys, there isn't any such thing as a simple organism. You know what I mean by that. Even ants have a communication mechanism. That can't even be explained by evolution.
I know, right? I see comments all the time too. They go, well, why would God create disease or problems in the first place? And that all comes from the fall. That's why we can track genetics and deleterious mutations and even neutral mutations back into a certain point, right? So what happens is neutral mutations build up into the human body and any body, cellular-wise, about 12,000 times. And then after it reaches a particular limit, it neutralizes and balances itself out. Well, it hasn't reached equilibrium yet. So we know things haven't been alive for that time. That's where they came up with the genetic bottleneck theory, because something since it hasn't been there, it obviously has to be for some reason. So they invoke bottlenecks, where we just assume it's creation. It's pretty apparent. It's obvious. So I like genetics. I like understanding disease, and diseases build up rampantly. We have an annual increase in deleterious mutation diseases that come about by 12,000 a year. That's no mystery. We know that. We know that cancer is supposed to be 50% more in 10 years from now. That's a lot. That's 1 out of every 2 people that will have cancer. That's incredibly high. So if we don't have these such a thing as deleterious genetic mutation buildup, then I don't know what is.
Well, exactly. Good point. Hey, I wonder if R and Raw got drunk tonight because he was asked to he was, so upset about being asked to come in. No, I'm just speculating.
But it's so funny, just like Matt was just saying with, well, for one, they have no explanation for how natural selection can stop the genetic degradation of our genome. But the thing is, it's kind of like a double whammy. I was explaining it to Patient Beard in that last debate, that genetic entropy, the accumulation of deleterious mutations in our genomes, it falsifies universal common ancestry, but at the same time, it demonstrates biblical creation, because that's exactly what we would expect after the fall: death, decay, not only in the universe itself, but in the genome. So they just keep misunderstanding that fact, and they actually have no real rebuttal to it. Have you ever actually looked? Because I've looked at their best rebuttals to something like genetic entropy, and there's no actual peer-reviewed papers that address it, because all population geneticists agree that man is presently degenerating. But they've got a couple blogs, and they've got like a review on Amazon.com or something. And that's all they have. And it's funny because when you argue with these atheists, those are the same arguments that they're using. Nothing but weak, easily debunked arguments.
Yeah, it's.
Go ahead.
And even this, Neff, are you there, brother? Are you there, Matt?
Yeah, I'm here. My computer did a wave, so I don't know if his did the same.
I'm not too sure if he's. But even this this paper that I presented it many times because I've looked. There's no actual critique of it. There's no rebuttal. It's been read by 10,000 scientists, and it's actually falsified universal common descent. It's called the waiting time problem. And it has to do with the evolution of a hominid population and how long it would take just for 2 nucleotides in that genome and switch them to 2 other nucleotides at the same location. And it goes into great depths explaining how, like, if you're just waiting for a single mutation, just a single nucleotide change, and you're waiting for the change to take hold in the population and then become selected to fixation because that's what they need, it would take about 1.5 million years, and it only goes up from there. And to get a string of 8, the more you read on, which would be equivalent to a short genetic word, you literally need more time than the universe has had. So there's a huge waiting time problem for just the evolution of man. It makes evolution impossible.
Oh yeah, especially their time frame that we've actually shown. They said that the missing link common ancestor was probably somewhere around 135,000 years ago. So they said that's probably when the human genetic bottleneck probably occurred. But when they look in their own fossil record, there was no bottleneck. So they're at a huge problem. That's why they said, well, mitochondrial Eve and Adam probably just weren't the only individuals that there were. Yeah. But unfortunately, the math proves that wrong as well. So they're in trouble. They have to come up with more rescuing devices.
They do, and everything is a rescue device. Imagine, Matt, a little while ago, you were talking about the abiogenesis idea is implausible, partly because they've discovered that the Earth has always had an abundant amount of oxygen and water, as far as they can tell. The theory is that the Earth was once a ball of magma that was floating in space, and it cooled over millions of years, and comets struck the planet and brought the water that is now our oceans. It was bombarded by an unbelievable, wow, would that have to be an unbelievable number of comets, right, to bring that much water to the Earth, for one thing. But then where's this idea then that there's not oxygen or water for abiogenesis to occur if the very oceans themselves were brought to it? Imagine that before the comet bombardment happened, there was no water on the Earth. Evolution can't start there. Abiogenesis, even if it were possible, it's not. But even if it were possible, there's no water. Life isn't going to exist where there's no water and no oxygen. So life couldn't have evolved before the bombardment took place. It would have had to have taken place early in the bombardment stage, and then of course survived the bombardment. Wow, you really got to package a lot of just so stories. Well, no, they just happened to never get hit by a comet, or no shockwave ever came by and wiped out the thing that just evolved. It just happened that way. It was amazing.
Well, that's why I always say it's a science fiction religion. It's something they have to believe in. There's a lot of storytelling. It's one big giant fairy tale, and a lot of this only happens, like, say, chemical evolution, abiogenesis, the origin of species, universal common ancestry. It only happens in the imagination of the evolutionist who wants to believe in it so bad. So at the end of the day, they can believe in it all they want, but it takes blind faith, and it's a science fiction religion. And when they argue it as if it's empirical science, that's when I get fired up, because what they're doing is they're hijacking science and hiding their religion under the word science, but it has nothing to do with science.
Exactly. Well, the problem that we have is, they're using truth and they're mixing it with lies. They're combining us with things that we aren't. They'll say like, "Oh, humans are, we're in the same category with apes." And then you say, "Really? Okay. Well, how can we prove that?" And they go, "Well, we're the same as them." Really? Because I don't look like them. So they'll go, "Okay, well, let's look more advanced than that. Let's look past. Okay, let's do that. Let's look at genetics." And then we find that we're, some genetic similarities. And then you look at the genetic similarities in other things and you find, oh, we're even more in line with a general house cat than we are with an ape. So then they go, well, look at comparative anatomy then. See, we look very similar. It's like, well, really, because primates, for the most part, only one that exists is a fruitarian, like human beings, which is the owl monkey. All other ones are omnivores. We're frugivores. Our complete digestion is at 12 to 18 hours. We have long saculated colons. We metabolize only small amounts of vitamin A, which require no cholesterol. We require fiber for peristalsis. We have high alkaline and urine and weak hydrochloric acid. But omnivores have everything the opposite of that. I can go down the list of homology on how we do not match primates whatsoever. But, as soon as you say that doesn't match, they go, well, it's okay that we don't match entirely, of course.
Exactly.
So, I don't know. They have an argument
Right.
against everything. It's crazy.
That's right. Phylogenetics is really it's a huge package of assumptions. We expect genetic similarity if we have a common designer, but one of the things the evolutionists don't tell you about is all the incongruencies in their phylogenetics. For example, let me give you a statement by a science paper titled "An Estimation of the Encridae Phylogeny: A Combined Analysis Approach." This was posted in PLOS journal. They state this: incongruencies across different data sets is not a novel observation within mammalian phylogenetic analysis. Therefore, in a final test.
Whoa.
Well, it looks like he, Neff, you there, brother?
Neff, you want Link dead?
He might just have to come back in. But what kind of jumped out at me, what you were talking about with homology and how little we actually do share with what evolutionists want to. I think a good way to start a debate, Matt, you mentioned it. We need to ask, what was the question we need to ask them about whether or not they're a monkey?
I said a great way to start a debate was like, please tell me, are you an ape? Do you believe that we came from apes? And are you an ape? Because if you agree then we can move on, right? Just state out loud for everybody that you believe you're a monkey, and that's fine. Go with that. Mm-hmm. And then we'll state our model, and we believe that that's not true and that you're above an animal.
And it's so funny because, even in my debate with Patient Beard, when he cut me off and said, "Oh, you're not presenting a model," and he cut me off right after I proved that humans are not apes and they are created separately and uniquely in the image of God. And I not only proved this from the Bible, but also from DNA evidence. And that's confirmation of what Genesis describes as man being created in the image of God. And you're talking about homology. And if you look at DNA now, some of these evolutionists, they're still so ignorant that they'll say stuff like, we're related through 98 to 99% of our DNA code. But the thing is, it's all based on preferential and selective treatment of data. It's cherry picked. They don't include non-aligned DNA gaps, copy number variations, size difference, and the actual genetic identity, which as well, Matt, we've talked about. It's only 88% or even lower at this point. And that's 400 million DNA differences. One DNA differences could be detrimental. That's 400 million.
Right. I popped out. I guess you guys didn't hear anything I said.
You cut out pretty early.
Yeah, you cut out about 2 minutes ago.
Okay, so let me. I'm downloading something. That's why I paused that download. But let me give you just one statement. They don't want to talk about the incongruencies in their phylogenetics. They don't talk about that, and there's tremendous number of incongruencies are everywhere. Things that don't match up with their idea of phylogenetics. For example, biologist Dr. Jonathan Wells, he's an intelligent design proponent, stated in the American Spectator, December 2000. He said this, but biologists have known for 100 years that homologous structures are often not produced by similar development pathways, and they have known for 30 years that they are not often produced by similar genes either. So there is no empirically demonstrated mechanism to establish that homologies are due to common ancestry rather than common design. Now, that's a very interesting subject, because what scientists have discovered, for example, is that the front legs of the front legs of a frog are developed by a different set of homeobox genes than the wings of a bird or the front limbs of a gecko. Now, that's not consistent with evolution theory. If evolution had produced the front legs of creatures in the distant past, it should have preserved those genes with modification, changing them so that they now produce, instead of the legs of this creature, but the difference in the legs of another kind of creature. And as birds evolved from reptiles, then those same genes should have been preserved, just modified, so now that they don't produce front legs like in a frog anymore, but they produce wings. The problem is they're not even the same sets of genes. The genes that produce the wings in a bird are not the same genes that produce the front legs in a frog, which are not the same genes that produce the front legs in a gecko. Now, that doesn't jive with evolution theory. They're different genetic developmental pathway for the front limbs on these different creatures, and going even back to fish. So they don't like to tell you about these. If evolution were true, it should have preserved those very same genes to produce the front limbs, for example, in all those species, and just modified them so that the limbs they produce are different, just like the wings of a bird are different from the legs of a frog, right? Instead, they're completely different homeobox genes. See, so evolution would have to start from scratch and create new sets of homeobox genes to produce the front limbs. But wait a minute, evolution tells us that the reason a bird has wings, front limbs, is the same reason that a frog has front limbs and a gecko has front limbs, and that a fish has flippers, fins at the front of its anatomy, is because evolution preserved that. That's the whole homologous structure of comparative anatomy argument, right? But it doesn't wash, because in many cases they find that the genes that produce them are different sets of genes in different locations of the DNA for these different species. That's completely not in line with what evolution theory tells you, would have us believe. But evolutionists don't like discussing the incongruencies in their phylogenetics, and there's many examples. But they somehow, isn't it marvelous, they don't like telling anybody about the an outrageous number of incongruencies with their phylogenetics.
Well, I kind of caught the end there with the inconsistencies and lack of uniqueness of the phylogenetic trees, as you were talking about, and how they just explain it away through convergent evolution. Did you talk about the protein Preston, Neff?
No, I didn't mention that protein specifically.
Well, it's hilarious because whales, dolphins, and bats, they're the only mammals that have echolocation system, and on the basis of just gross anatomy, the whales and dolphins are classified closer to the cow than the bats. But on the basis of their echolocation systems, if we look at that, they should belong with the bats. But then when we look at molecular analysis of this protein I'm talking about, Preston, it puts whales and dolphins squarely with the bats. And the Preston molecules in whales and dolphins, I think they've got 14 amino acids that are not in the Preston molecule of any other mammals except for the bats, whose protein Preston also has those same 14 amino acids. So molecular analysis, as well as just looking at gross anatomy, proves that these phylogenetic trees don't even represent objective reality. Yeah. And to be honest with you, anybody with common sense knows that this actually falsifies their theory.
Right. Right. It's right. That's correct. Let me provide you one more statement, because evolutionists they say, oh, that's baloney, but the creationists don't. They don't have anything to back up what they say. Oh, yes, I do. This is from Carl Woes. He's the microbiologist. He's famed for discovering the third domain of life, the archaea. And he said this in 1998, and I quote him: "No consistent organismal phylogeny has emerged from the many individual protein phylogenies so far produced." And he's also said, phylogenetic incongruencies can be seen everywhere in the universal tree, from its root to the major branchings and among the various taxa that make up the primary groups themselves. So, I mean, are we to believe what he says, that there are an insurmountable number of phylogenetic incongruencies, that things just don't add up to the tree of life posited by the evolutionists? Well, of course he knows what he's talking about. This is a world-renowned biologist. He's not making this up. You think he's going to tell a story to all his peers and everybody look at him with a raised eyebrow and say, what the heck did he just say? What a nutbag. Let's get rid of this guy. No, of course not. So it's true. The evolutionists don't like talking about their tremendous number of phylogenetic incongruencies. They only point out whenever they find a protein that's very, very similar to another protein in a different species, they'll claim, oh, look, evolution explains it. But one of the problems with that is that proteins are so incredibly specific that a difference of only 1 or 3 amino acids means a tremendously great problem for evolution. And you can't point to a similarity in a protein in a chimpanzee in a human being and say, look, this is proof that evolution is true. No, it's proof that the complexity of a protein is something that can never be produced by evolution, and that there's a fundamentally tremendous difference in the biology of a chimpanzee and a human being that evolution theory can never span. Just can't be true. By this alone, we know evolution can't be true, that 80% of the proteins in the human genome are different by at least 1 amino acid from those of chimpanzees, because evolution, firstly, can't even produce a protein. It'd be impossible. And secondly, if a mutation changes a protein code so that a single amino acid gets substituted with the wrong one and changes the protein, then you've got a terrible problem, because now you've got a disease. And, you can't say evolution proceeds on the back of a disease-making process. So, come on. But they don't want to tell you about the inconsistencies. They only tell you about things that look like they work for evolution theory, if you believe the premise to begin with.
I agree. They have a lot of problems. They, apparently evolution is just supposed to help you adapt to wherever you're at, as long as you survive as a species. Yet human beings, however, are inferior to these primates in every way. Literally, physically, our muscle tissues are very, very weak. They have a powerful jaw. They can crack through coconuts in one bite. They have a completely powerful immune system, almost immune to all infection. They have dense fur. We lost ours, so now what? We have to wear clothing. That makes sense. They don't sunburn. We sunburn. We get skin cancer all the time. They don't even get any cancer. They have way better DNA methylation. So they expect us to believe that. I can go down the list, by the way. They expect us to believe that we morphologically just evolved all those beneficial mutations away just so we can talk. Stupid.
Yeah. Well, that's the evolutionists. Ignore all the tremendous problems and tell you about with evolutionists, it's all patternicity and similarity. That's what the whole idea is based on. Every similarity between 2 different types of living thing, the evolutionist sees as evidence of common ancestry. Human beings have 2 nostrils. A gecko has 2 nostrils. Oh, look at there. Evolution, evidence of evolution, common ancestry. It's any similarity in their mind is evidence of evolution. But the tremendous the problems with evolution theory are so many. One of them is, as I pointed about genetic incongruencies in the phylogeny, and another is, of course, everybody knows that the fossil record simply doesn't support evolution. There's no series of transitional fossils you can show that give us a picture of one kind of life evolving into another. No such thing exists in the fossil record. And so we don't have a record of it ever happening. We don't have any, we can't even make a picture of it happening from the creatures that existed in the past. And the list just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I think one of the worst, most destructive things to the evolution theory is proteins. And evolutionists have to believe that proteins evolved, that they actually came into being, and that changes to existing protein codes is why the proteins in one type of creature are different by so many thousands of them from the proteins in a creature that is supposedly reasonably closely related to over evolutionary history. The problem with that is that you can't willy-nilly change the mutations cannot evolve protein. The proteins are so highly specific, you damage them and you result in disease, weakness, deformity when you mess around with protein codes. Who was it? Douglas Axe, the biologist Douglas Axe of the Discovery Institute. You know, he was fired for allowing an intelligent design paper written by Dr. Michael Behe to get published in a journal. And Douglas Axe says you need at least 6 mutations just to change a single fold in a protein. And there are thousands and thousands of folds in proteins, you know, in most proteins. You'd have to have 6 mutations that have to be preserved just to get one functional protein fold, right? A functional one. And the problem with that is it's like the odds of that are like saying, if I shoot enough BBs up into the air and so that they'll land on that swimming pool surface, if I shoot 14 million of them, they will form a pyramid nicely stacked and all square on sides under the water. That's what's going to happen when I keep shooting BBs. The odds of that happening is just so high. We would say it's never going to happen. That's crazy to believe that. The same thing is true with believing that 6 mutations in a row that are going to create a functional fold in a new functional fold in a protein are ever going to be occur and be preserved, especially is just like those kinds of odds, especially since we see that when mutation affects the folding of the protein, what mutations do to protein codes is disaster. So how could that be true even in the most ridiculous way of thinking? Evolutionism is so anti-science, it's not even funny.
I know. They're always saying, the Bible doesn't have any evidence. You can't prove anything. Well, how about you do yourself a favor and actually read the thing? And then what you can do is you can line up the odds of the empirical evidence that we have, and you can look and you can say, okay, well, let's take a look at some worldwide floods. And then you'll notice that the stories have always 8 survivors. Then you can look at human relatedness up to 99.9%, just like the Bible says, we're all one. Then you can say, where did all human beings originally come from? Oh, it looks like the Fertile Crescent, exactly where the Bible says. How about the odds of where all the people came from? Exactly where they said first man evolved. It's the same theory. They said that man, right, what did they eat before they invented cooking, right? They lived off plants, just like the Garden of Eden story talks about. Yeah. Or how about that we've been genetically deteriorating? We know that diseases are going up more and more and more. How about the fact that all human beings come from a single female and male ancestor, just like the Bible says? I mean, wow, how much you want to go that the earth was just like a Garden of Eden rather than it being eons of nothing or for meteors hitting it. I mean, how much correlation do you want? I can go on.
Right, exactly. Evolution theory is a replacement theory. Oh, look, this we replace this truth with another, and they do it over and over and over. But as you point out, the evidence that they continuously discover evidence that does nothing but verify the biblical account. Over and over and again. Just like you pointed out, the Earth was once a waterless ball of magma, and it never had an abundance of oxygen or water or anything. And then they discover, wow, the deepest rocks they can find are saturated with water and have an abundance of oxygen locked up in them. Looks like the Earth has always been abundant with oxygen and water. So everything they keep discovering it continuously verifies the biblical account, Matt. That's exactly right. They just keep making more and more discoveries that line up exactly with what the scriptures say.
Yeah, and then they say in comment, well, that doesn't prove there's a God. You're right. It just proves the Bible absolutely perfectly correct on everything scientific. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Get out of it. Go play in the freeway.
Yeah. That's right. They just keep verifying the Bible, and they refuse to see it.
Yeah. I mean, we write articles all the time. They're in our work. You can go and you can read everything. You can read the updated science. You can read everything. We keep up to date on everything. I mean, the new studies that when they thought the Milano protein was a new beneficial mutation, and then they realized, no, it's just another epigenetic regulation. And then they go, well, how about when the Sherpa people that were living really high up in altitude? Well, guess what? If it was a beneficial mutation, it would have carried on. And they don't find that it does, because when they move away, that epigenetic regulation switch turns back off and they can no longer do good at high altitudes. So everything again, yet again, it's been debunked, man. It's over for them. They're the ones that are mad at us. They're the ones here in chat room. They don't like creation. They don't like God, but yet here they are listening. It's so upsetting. Go do something else. What in the world are you doing here? You're just upsetting yourself.
I think it's because deep down inside they know that their precious evolutionary theory doesn't really have any actual evidence anyways. Because obviously all the evidence we're providing, I mean, you can either just be a science denier or accept it for what it is. But I did want to say one last thing, Neff. Once again, great job tonight. You really stood your ground. You took on 3, 4 of them from the non-sequitur. You didn't stumble once, so great job. Matt, good talking to you. I'm going to have to let you guys go right now. But Neff, thanks for having me on, brother. And hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Nice. Later.